Margaret Cross set her champagne glass down with the kind of careful precision that meant she was about to say something cruel. She waited until Naomi was close enough to hear, then tilted her head toward the head bridesmaid and said, "Just loud enough." "She really did try, didn't she? The dress almost fits." Sienna laughed. Not the uncomfortable laugh of someone caught off guard, the easy laugh of someone who'd heard the joke before and had been waiting for her cue. Naomi heard every word. She kept walking. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and realized that every smile directed at you was calculated, every kind word was a script, stay with this story until the very end. What Naomi Carter did on her wedding day didn't just expose one woman's betrayal or one family's greed. It dismantled an entire system built to destroy her quietly, and it happened in front of every person those people had ever tried to impress. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it started. Naomi Carter had spent 11 years learning how to read things that didn't want to be read. That was the actual job description, if you stripped away the formal language on her museum ID badge. A conservator's work was about damage that hid itself, paint layers that looked intact from 3 feet away and revealed their cracks only under raking light, varnish that had yellowed so slowly over decades that no single person had watched it happen, structural failures in canvas that looked fine until the day they didn't. You trained yourself to look past the surface presentation. You trained yourself not to trust the first reading. She'd been good at that work, patient in a way that made some of her colleagues slightly uncomfortable because real patience, the kind that could hold still for 6 hours over a small section of gilded frame without checking her phone, wasn't a personality trait most people had developed by the time they hit their mid-30s. Naomi had it. Had always had it. What she hadn't developed until recently was the ability to apply that same attention to the people around her. That was the gap the Cross family had walked right through. She was standing in the east dressing suite of the Cross estate, 40 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin, and everything about the room was beautiful in the way of things that had been carefully selected to communicate wealth rather than comfort. The drapes were heavy ivory silk. The vanity mirror was framed in gilt that was probably original to the house, circa 1920s, and she'd noticed 2 stress fractures in the upper right corner that nobody else would have caught. Flowers, white peonies, cream roses, something with trailing greenery she couldn't name, filled 3 separate arrangements positioned around the room with the kind of spacing that suggested a professional hadn't just arranged them, but had also measured the distances between vases. Sienna was sitting on the small settee near the window, scrolling through her phone. She was wearing the bridesmaid dress Naomi had chosen, deep blush, simple cut, nothing that would compete, and she looked genuinely beautiful in it. She looked relaxed. She'd looked relaxed all morning, which Naomi had registered somewhere in the back of her mind and filed without examining. "You're doing the thing again," Sienna said without looking up. "What thing?" "The thing where you go very quiet and your eyes go somewhere else." She finally glanced up, and her smile was warm and immediately present, the way it always was. "You're not nervous, are you? Because you don't need to be nervous. You've already done the hard part." "What's the hard part?" "Picking him." Sienna set her phone face down on the settee cushion. "Everything else is just a party." Naomi looked at her in the mirror. "Your dress looks good." "It does, doesn't it?" Sienna smoothed the fabric over her knee. "You have good taste, Naomi. That's always been the thing about you. You know what's real and what isn't." She paused just a beat. "Most of the time." She said it lightly and then moved on immediately. Asked about the bouquet, said something about the photographer being difficult, redirected the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who'd been having conversations they meant to steer for a very long time. Naomi answered. She kept her face exactly as it needed to be. But that pause sat in the room like a splinter, small and invisible, and she felt it every time she moved. She had met Damien Cross 2 years and 4 months ago at an acquisitions review for a private collection his company was donating to the museum. He wasn't supposed to be there. That kind of handoff was usually handled by legal teams and cultural liaisons, not by the actual billionaire. But the liaison had apparently been caught in a contract dispute, and Damien had shown up himself, slightly late, with coffee for a meeting where coffee hadn't been offered, and had spent 20 minutes asking questions that indicated he'd actually read the collection catalog rather than been briefed on it that morning. She'd thought, This one pays attention. That was what had done it. Not the money, not the jaw, not the fact that he wore a watch that probably cost more than her annual salary, with the ease of someone who'd forgotten it was on his wrist. The paying attention. The specific, directed, genuine paying attention. They'd had dinner that Friday. By the following month, she knew that she was in something real, and that frightened her a little because real things could be damaged, and real things required you to show your actual surfaces rather than your presentation. Damien had made that easier than she'd expected. He was not a smooth man, which surprised her. He was a capable one. There was a difference. Smooth men had learned to perform confidence in ways that made the performance invisible. Damien simply moved through things with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who'd spent years solving problems because the problems were there and needed solving, not because he wanted credit for the solving. He said exactly what he thought, not unkindly, but without the buffer of social performance. He forgot to compliment things that were supposed to be complimented. He remembered things she'd mentioned in passing 4 months later, completely without fanfare, as if the filing system in his head didn't categorize certain information as more important than other information. She'd told him about a difficult restoration she was working on, an early 20th century oil painting where the previous restorer had used the wrong consolidant and the paint layers were delaminating in a way that made her lose sleep. He'd listened without trying to fix it or diminish it, and 2 weeks later he'd sent her an article about a conservation lab in Amsterdam that had developed a new injection technique for exactly that kind of failure. No comment. Just the article. Subject line, "Thought this might help." She'd married him for the article about the Amsterdam lab. That was the simple truth of it. His parents were a different matter from the beginning, and she hadn't needed her conservator's eye to read that. Margaret Cross was 63 years old and had spent those years constructing herself with the same deliberate care she applied to everything in her environment. She was not naturally elegant. Naomi had understood this early because truly natural elegance didn't work this hard at itself. Margaret's elegance was engineered. The posture held by a muscle memory that required daily maintenance. The voice pitched at exactly the register that communicated authority without effort. The eyes that took inventory of a room and cataloged its contents without appearing to move. She had looked at Naomi at their first meeting, a dinner at the estate that Damien had described as low-key, just a chance to meet, and which had been neither low-key nor casual in any way, and done a very quick, very complete assessment, and then smiled with all the warmth of a closed door. "Damien has told us so little about you," she'd said. "A conservator. I imagine that's very exacting work." "It is," Naomi had said. "And you work at the—" She'd named the museum with a slight pause before it, the kind of pause that indicated familiarity without enthusiasm. "How long have you been there?" 11 years. "Lovely." Margaret had turned to her husband. "Isn't that lovely, Gerald?" Gerald Cross was a larger man who had clearly once been physically imposing and now was simply large in the way of structures that had settled over time. He had the handshake of someone who believed a handshake communicated character and had not updated this belief since approximately 1987. He'd looked at Naomi the way he probably looked at quarterly reports, quickly, with the specific attention of someone searching for the number that concerned him, and then made polite noises about the museum and moved on. The dinner had been exquisitely uncomfortable in the way that required everyone present to pretend it wasn't. Damien had squeezed her hand under the table twice. She'd squeezed back both times and not said anything about it afterward. Later, in the car, he'd said, "They're not easy people." No. "They're better when you know them longer." She had looked at him and said nothing, because she'd believed him and also hadn't believed him, and she hadn't yet figured out how to hold both things at once. That dinner had been 8 months ago. The Damien who had said his parents got better with time had been telling her the truth as he understood it. She knew that now, in the dressing suite with the peonies and the ivory drapes, she could look back at that dinner and see what she hadn't seen then. That Damien believed his parents were complicated but ultimately tolerable because he'd spent his whole life developing the specific set of coping mechanisms required to make them tolerable. And those mechanisms were so automatic by now that he'd stopped recognizing them as mechanisms at all. He thought everyone adapted eventually. He didn't realize that his parents hadn't wanted her to adapt. The first thing that hadn't been right was the invitation list. Naomi had been given a spreadsheet of proposed guests 2 months before the wedding and had gone through it with Damien on a Sunday afternoon in his apartment, crossing off people they both agreed they didn't need and adding a handful they did. It had been a normal conversation, occasionally funny, occasionally the mild friction of two people discovering they had different opinions about whether a third person deserved to be celebrated with. Standard. Fine. 3 weeks later, the printed invitations had gone out, and the list had changed. Not drastically, subtly. 12 names added that Naomi didn't recognize, all of them in Damien's mother's social orbit. 6 names removed that Naomi had specifically asked to include 3 colleagues from the museum she'd known for years, her neighbor Mrs. Patton, who was 71 and had looked after Naomi's cat during every work trip for the last 4 years, and her 2 closest friends from graduate school. She'd noticed because she'd saved the original spreadsheet. When she raised it with Damien, he'd gone quiet in that particular way he went quiet when something had the look of a deliberate action, but he couldn't bring himself to assign deliberate intent. Mom handles the formal invitations, he'd said. She probably thought she was being helpful, streamlining. She removed people I asked for. I know. I'll fix it. He'd paused. I'll talk to her. He had talked to her. Mrs. Patton had received her invitation 2 days later, with a handwritten note from Margaret that said she hoped the delay hadn't caused any inconvenience. The graduate school friends hadn't been reinstated. Naomi had let it go. She understood why she'd let it go. There was a calculation that happened in situations like that, the calculation of how hard to push on which things, how to measure the cost of a fight against the importance of the thing being fought over, how to distinguish between the hills worth dying on and the ones that were just uncomfortable. She had calculated and decided and let it go. She had let several things go in the months leading up to the wedding. The florist who had somehow understood that Naomi's preference for garden roses meant something other than garden roses, resulting in an arrangement she hadn't ordered. The venue layout that had been adjusted, improved, Margaret had said, just some small improvements, in ways that placed the Cross family at the visual center of the ceremony, in configurations that placed Naomi's small, quieter contingent at the edges. The photographer who had come highly recommended by Margaret, and who had, at the engagement shoot, spent the majority of his time framing shots that prominently featured Damien and minimized Naomi to the point where she appeared, in several of the proofs, to be slightly out of focus. Each thing, individually, was explainable. Each thing had a reasonable surface reading. Florists misunderstood. Layouts got adjusted. Photographers had their own aesthetic. It was the pattern that wasn't explainable. And Naomi Carter, who had spent 11 years learning how to read the patterns that hid inside surfaces, had finally started reading. It had started 3 weeks before the wedding, at a dinner she wasn't supposed to be at. She'd arrived at the estate early. She'd been consulting with the venue coordinator about a lighting question, and she'd come in through the side entrance that the estate staff used, the one that opened near the library, because the front gate intercom was malfunctioning, and the estate manager had told her to use the side entrance until it was fixed. She'd heard voices in the library. She hadn't intended to listen. She'd been trying to find someone to let her in properly. Margaret's voice was very clear. Not after the wedding. The timing is too obvious. It needs to begin before the ink is dry. Sienna understands what's at stake. A pause. Gerald's voice lower. You're certain she won't get sentimental? Sienna doesn't get sentimental. She gets compensated. A brief sound that might have been Margaret setting something down. The documents are already prepared. Once the affair is established, and it won't take long, Damien isn't made of stone. We move the fraud evidence to her accounts. By the time she realizes what's happened, the marriage will be in dissolution and she'll be facing charges. Nobody will believe a word she says. Another pause. And Damien? Damien will be devastated. He'll want someone to blame. The voice had something in it that was neither warmth nor coldness, but the specific temperature of absolute certainty. He'll blame her. He always chooses the cleaner story. Naomi had stood completely still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she had taken out her phone and pressed record. Trot. She'd left the estate that day without speaking to anyone. She'd driven back to her apartment, sat in her car in the parking structure for a while, and then gone upstairs and made tea and sat at her kitchen table with her hands around the mug until the mug went cold. Then she'd opened her laptop. The thing about Naomi's work was that it required a particular relationship with documentation. Everything was logged: treatment records, condition reports, photographic evidence before and after every procedure. The language of the profession was the language of evidence. You wrote down what you observed, what you did, what changed, in the specific vocabulary of someone who understood that their notes might someday need to explain a decision to someone who hadn't been there. You built a record that could stand independently of your presence. She was good at building records. She spent the next 3 days doing what she did best. She pulled every email she had from anyone connected to the wedding planning and read them in sequence, looking for the pattern she'd already felt but hadn't named. She found it quickly once she knew what she was looking for: the small redirections, the apologetic adjustments that weren't quite apologies, the CCs that included Margaret's assistant where they hadn't previously included Margaret's assistant. She found 3 email exchanges where vendors had received what appeared to be confirmations from her, using her name from an address that was 1 character different from her actual email address, that contradicted requests she'd actually made. Someone had been impersonating her in vendor communications. She documented it: screenshot, timestamp, saved to 3 separate locations. She reached out quietly to 2 vendors on the pretense of confirming final details, and during those conversations established that their understanding of her preferences had been shaped by instructions they'd received that she hadn't sent. She was careful. She didn't alarm them. She just asked questions in the patient, methodical way of someone who needed to understand the complete picture before doing anything with it. Then she looked at Sienna. Sienna Brooks had been her cousin, second cousin, technically, on her mother's side, for 31 years. They hadn't been close as children. Their families moved in different enough circles that they'd seen each other mainly at the major gatherings, the ones you attended not because you were summoned but because skipping them required more energy than attending. Sienna had been the beautiful one, had always been the beautiful one, in the specific way that people who are aware of their beauty develop around it: a fluency with attention, an ease with rooms that required the ability to be looked at without flinching. She'd reached out to Naomi 18 months ago. Just a message: "Hey, I keep seeing your engagement announcement everywhere. Congratulations. It's been too long." They'd had coffee, then lunch. Then Sienna had mentioned that she was between jobs and between apartments in the way of someone whose life had gone through a restructuring, and Naomi had felt the pull of family loyalty and suggested that maybe Sienna could be involved in the wedding. The maid of honor conversation had come naturally. Later, Naomi would think about how naturally it had come and feel the specific sick feeling of someone who has realized that a naturally arriving thing was engineered. She looked at Sienna's financials. She wasn't a forensic accountant, and she didn't have access to Sienna's actual bank records, but she had access to Sienna's lifestyle, and she had a brain that noticed discrepancies, and once she started looking, she found them quickly. The apartment Sienna had moved into after claiming to be between places was in a building that didn't match the financial circumstances Sienna had described. It had a doorman. It was in a neighborhood where Naomi knew roughly what rents ran. The new car, registered in Sienna's name, was not the car of someone who was between jobs. She cross-referenced the dates. Sienna's financial situation had visibly improved approximately 4 months ago. The engagement had been publicly announced 5 months ago. 1 month after the announcement, Sienna had reached out. Naomi sat with that timeline for a long time. Then she called a friend. Not a close friend, an acquaintance really, someone she'd known at graduate school who had gone into forensic document analysis, the kind of field that required both the patience of a conservator and a specific legal literacy Naomi didn't have herself. She explained what she had, carefully, in the language of hypotheticals, asking not for help, but for context. What would corporate fraud evidence, if fabricated and planted in someone's financial records, actually look like? What would you need to pull it off? How long would it take to discover? Her acquaintance was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a very specific hypothetical." "I know," Naomi said. "The answer is enough time to be convincing and long enough to do real damage before it unraveled." "Months? Minimum. Possibly more than a year, depending on how good the documents were." Naomi thanked her and hung up and sat looking at the wall. Then she called Damien. Ashitin. The conversation with Damien lasted 4 hours and happened in his office. because he'd said he needed to sit down for it, and she'd agreed, and his office was the most private space either of them had access to that wasn't the estate. She told him everything in the order she'd found it. The recording first, because that was the piece that made everything else make sense rather than just seem paranoid. She watched his face go through several things while he listened. The initial expression of someone who has heard their parents criticized before and has the reflexive defenses up, and then the expression of someone whose defenses are failing against specific evidence, and then a much quieter and more complicated expression that had something of grief in it, and something of a man who has suspected something for a long time, and finally has confirmation he'd been hoping wouldn't come. She stopped the recording. He was quiet for a while. The office was very quiet. Somewhere outside a phone rang once and stopped. "The forged documents," he said finally. "In your accounts." "That's what she said. I haven't found them yet." "I have," he said. "I've been looking at irregularities in the company's financial records for about 8 months. I knew someone had access they shouldn't have. I didn't know who yet." He paused. "I didn't know it was going to land on you." "You were already investigating." "I brought in an outside firm, quietly." He looked up. "I didn't tell you because I didn't have anything concrete and I didn't want to. I didn't want to make you worry about things that might resolve themselves." "That was a mistake," she said. "Yes." No argument, no defense. Just yes. "It was." They looked at each other across his desk. "So," she said. "So," he said. "We could cancel the wedding." He was quiet for a moment. "We could?" "Or," she said carefully, "we could let it happen." He looked at her. Not the look of someone who hadn't thought of this, the look of someone who had thought of it and needed to hear someone else say it. "They need to be in one room," she said. "All the evidence needs to be in one room. The guests, the people they've spent 40 years building their reputation in front of, need to be in one room." She paused. "We'd only have one shot." Damien was quiet for a long time. Then, "The firm. The investigators. They've been building toward a legal case. Today would it help them? A public confrontation with documentation isn't exactly standard procedure." He thought about it. "But it's not a crime." He looked at her steadily. "And everything we show would be legally obtained." "Yes." Another silence. Outside, the city moved and made its city sounds. "Naomi." "What?" "Are you sure?" She thought about Margaret's voice in the library, the certainty in it, the particular kind of certainty that came from decades of being right because you were in a position to make yourself right. The voice of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility that the person they were planning to sacrifice might be paying attention. "Yes," she said, "I'm sure." He nodded slowly. "Then we're getting married," he said. "Mont." The morning of the wedding, Naomi woke before the alarm and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling and thought about her mother, who had died when Naomi was 19 and who would have had things to say about all of this. Her mother had been a practical woman, more practical than warm, which was not the same as being cold. She'd simply never had much patience for the performance of feelings over the actual having of them. She would have said something dry and accurate about the crosses that would have made Naomi laugh despite everything. Naomi missed her in the quiet, particular way of someone who has been missing the same person for a long time. She got up. She showered. She ate half a piece of toast because she was not going to be the woman who didn't eat on her wedding day, and then discovered at 3 p.m. that she was sustaining a major confrontation on no calories. She put on the first layer of things that required putting on and waited for the car to take her to the estate. In the car, she checked her phone. 3 messages from Damien, sent in the sequence of a man who had things to say, but was trying to say them efficiently. The investigators are positioned, the materials are loaded and ready, and then, separately, you look beautiful in the photo from the photographer's test shots this morning. She looked at that last one for a moment. Then she put her phone away. At the estate, she walked through the east entrance, past the courtyard with its imported stone and its carefully maintained impermanence, up the stairs to the dressing suite. She sat in the chair they'd positioned in front of the gilt-framed mirror with the 2 stress fractures in the upper right corner and looked at her own face while a woman she didn't know did things to it with brushes. She looked like someone who was getting married. She also looked, if you knew what to look for, like someone who was paying attention. Margaret appeared at the door of the dressing suite at 10:45. She was already fully assembled. The gown a dove-gray architecture of controlled elegance, the jewelry calibrated, the posture that required daily maintenance performing exactly as it had been maintained to perform. She looked at Naomi in the mirror and allowed a small, practiced smile. "You look lovely, Naomi." "Thank you, Margaret. I wanted to come by before things get too busy." She stepped into the room, and her eyes moved over it the way they always moved over rooms. Inventory, catalog, assess. "I know this has been a complicated process. All the planning." A small pause. "I hope you know how much Gerald and I have been invested in making this perfect for Damien." Naomi looked at her in the mirror. "For Damien?" "For both of you, of course." The smile again, no warmer. "I just want the day to be everything it should be." "I think it will be," Naomi said. Something moved in Margaret's eyes. The slight recalibration of a woman who'd expected a different response and was adjusting. It lasted less than a second. Then she nodded graciously, said something about the flowers being particularly beautiful this year, and left. Sienna appeared in the doorway 30 seconds after Margaret disappeared down the hall, carrying 2 glasses of champagne with the ease of someone who'd been waiting just out of frame. "Pre-ceremony tradition," she said, offering one. "I'll have mine after," Naomi said. "Champagne on an empty stomach." "Oh, come on, one sip, for the jitters." Sienna smiled, the warm, immediate, present smile that Naomi had believed in for 18 months. "You're practically shaking." "I'm fine," Naomi said. She was not shaking. She had not been shaking all morning. Her hands were completely steady, the way her hands were always steady when she was working on something that required precision. Sienna set one glass down on the vanity table near Naomi's elbow. "Just in case," she said easily, and went back to the settee with her own glass. Naomi looked at the champagne glass in the mirror. Then she looked at her own face. The ceremony was in 40 minutes. She was ready. The champagne glass sat untouched on the vanity table for the entire 40 minutes leading up to the ceremony. Naomi watched it in the mirror the way she watched things she wasn't sure about, with the peripheral attention of someone who needed to keep the object in view without appearing to look directly at it. Sienna refilled her own glass once. She didn't mention the untouched one again. That itself was a data point. A woman who had genuinely offered a friendly drink would have asked a second time, would have made a small joke about it. Sienna had set it down and moved on with the smooth redirect of someone who'd accomplished what she needed to accomplish and didn't require the follow-through. Naomi didn't touch it. She also, in the last 10 minutes before the processional, excused herself briefly from the dressing suite under the pretense of a hem that needed checking with the alterations assistant, found a quiet hallway alcove, and took 3 photographs of the champagne glass from different angles using her phone, careful to capture the full glass in context of the suite. She wasn't sure what was in it. She wasn't sure anything was in it. But she had learned, in the past 3 weeks, that the cost of documenting things you ended up not needing was substantially lower than the cost of failing to document things you did. She put the phone back in the small emergency kit the wedding planner had given her and went back to the suite. "Hem's fine," she said. "I told you," Sienna said, smiling. Yet Balkot. The ceremony itself was 43 minutes long. Naomi had counted, not intentionally, but the way you count things when your mind is operating on 2 tracks simultaneously. The surface track that was moving through the ritual of a wedding, responding to cues, existing in the physical fact of the day, and the deeper track that was still running the calculation she'd been running for 3 weeks, checking and rechecking the variables, looking for anything she'd missed. She hadn't missed anything. She was reasonably sure she hadn't missed anything. But the thing about her work was that reasonable certainty wasn't the same as certainty, and there was always the possibility of the thing you couldn't have known to look for. Damien was already at the end of the aisle when she appeared, and the look he gave her when she came into his sightline was not the rehearsed emotion of a man performing a wedding. It was the look of a man who had spent the previous night in his own room going through the same mental calculation she'd been going through, who had also found no gaps in the plan, and who was also running on the specific energy of someone who had committed entirely to a thing and now had to simply be present in it and trust the preparation. He looked, she thought, like someone doing the most important work of his life. She understood that completely. She walked to him. He took her hands. The officiant said the words that officiants say, and they repeated what needed to be repeated, and at no point did either of them cry, which some of the guests probably found cold, and which was simply the truth of who they both were. People who felt things precisely rather than expressively, people who had learned that control was not the same as absence. Margaret sat in the front row and wore the expression of a woman presiding over something she owned. Gerald sat beside her and looked slightly past the proceedings, the way he looked slightly past most things, with the comfortable inattention of a man who had learned to occupy spaces without being particularly present in them. Sienna stood to Naomi's left, with her bouquet held correctly, and her face arranged in warm witnessing. Naomi said, "I do," and meant it, and for the brief moment the words were leaving her mouth, she let herself be simply there, in the uncomplicated fact of marrying the man she had decided to marry, and then she came back. When the officiant said they could kiss, Damien looked at her for 1 second before he leaned in, and in that second he communicated, without words, the same thing he'd communicated across his desk 4 days ago. "Are you ready?" She communicated back, "Yes." Then they kissed, and the room made the sound rooms make. The reception was scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock, with cocktail hour at 3. The Cross Estates ballroom had been set for 312 guests. The tables were dressed in the ivory and gold Margaret had selected. Naomi had originally wanted something simpler, and it had been explained to her, with great warmth and tremendous inflexibility, that the estate had a visual standard that certain choices would complement better than others. The floral centerpieces were extraordinary, the kind of extraordinary that required a great deal of money, and someone who knew exactly how to spend it on flowers. The bar was open. The string quartet in the corner was playing something elegant. Every surface of the room communicated with complete effectiveness that this was an event belonging to a family of consequence. That was, in the end, exactly what Naomi needed it to communicate. She moved through the cocktail hour with the practiced patience of someone who had learned to exist in rooms where she was not entirely comfortable. She spoke with people she knew and people she didn't. She accepted congratulations with genuine warmth and the occasional difficulty of someone who is not naturally given to receiving compliments about their own life choices. She found her 3 museum colleagues who had eventually made the guest list and had a real conversation about an upcoming exhibition that lasted longer than it probably should have, given the circumstances, because it was the most genuinely comfortable 7 minutes of the afternoon. Sienna stayed close through most of it. That was her job, ostensibly. Maid of honor, present and attentive, making sure the bride had what she needed. She was good at it. She brought Naomi a glass of water without being asked. She deflected 2 relatives who had opinions about the seating chart with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd been managing rooms for years. She laughed at the right moments and was quiet at the right moments. And Naomi watched all of it with the divided attention of someone who genuinely appreciated the skill even while cataloging it as performance. At one point, during a gap in the crowd, Sienna leaned close and said, "You're doing amazingly. I know this is overwhelming." "It's a lot of people," Naomi agreed. "You're holding up beautifully." Sienna squeezed her arm. "I'm proud of you, truly." Naomi looked at her. "Thank you, Sienna." She meant it and didn't mean it simultaneously, and the combination sat in her chest like something she'd swallowed wrong. Bolts. At 3:47, while the guests were beginning to transition from the cocktail space to the ballroom, Naomi stepped away from a conversation near the east windows and found a quiet corridor off the main hall. She typed a single text to the number Damien had given her, "Ready." The response came in under 30 seconds. Confirmed. She put her phone away and stood in the corridor for a moment. The sounds of the reception filtered through the door. Glasses and voices. The specific ambient noise of a large formal gathering in full motion. 312 people, most of them wealthy, most of them connected, most of them important in the specific and carefully maintained way of people who spent decades cultivating importance. Every person in that room was someone Margaret or Gerald Cross had spent years building themselves in front of. Naomi thought about what it meant to have built yourself in front of 300 people for decades, the kind of weight that identity carried, the kind of thing you would do to protect it. She thought about a woman in a library setting down a champagne glass, her voice carrying through the quiet with the certainty of someone who has never seriously entertained the possibility of being wrong. Then she straightened her dress and went back to the ballroom. The plan, such as it was, had been constructed with the same methodology Naomi applied to complex restorations. identify the load-bearing elements, establish the sequence, build redundancy into anything that could fail, and do not attempt the procedure until you are certain you can complete it. The load-bearing elements were three. First, the recording from the library, Naomi's phone recording, audio only, but clear identifiable voices, specific content. Second, the financial documentation, the paper trail Damien's investigators had been building for 8 months, showing not just the planned fraud against Naomi, but a larger pattern of financial crime running through the Cross family's corporate structure, going back further and reaching deeper than even Damien had initially suspected. Third, the communications between Margaret and Sienna, text messages, obtained through the investigators via legal channels during a period when Sienna's phone had been the subject of a broader financial inquiry, showing the specific recruitment, the specific instructions, the specific payments. Damien's technical team had spent 2 days loading all of it onto a presentation system that connected to the ballroom's existing AV setup, the same system that was going to be used for the toasts. The estate's AV manager had been told there were additional materials for a tribute presentation and had connected the external drive without question, because that was his job and the instruction had come through the proper channels. The sequence was Naomi's. She had written it out in her own handwriting on a notepad she'd subsequently destroyed, the way she documented treatment procedures, step by step, in order, with the contingency notation of someone who had thought about what happened if each step failed. She knew the order. She knew what would appear on the screens when she advanced each slide. She had reviewed it enough times that it was in her body, rather than her memory, accessible the way practiced physical movements are accessible, without requiring conscious retrieval. The redundancy was Damien. If anything went wrong, if she was interrupted, if the system failed, if something happened that she hadn't accounted for, he would take over. They had talked through that division of responsibility without drama or rehearsal anxiety, in the practical tone of two people who worked well together under pressure and had reached a clean understanding. He would watch. If she needed him, he would move. If she didn't, he would wait for his moment, which would come regardless. She walked to the head table and sat down, and the dinner began. She ate more than she expected to. That surprised her a little. She'd have predicted her appetite would be gone, the way it sometimes went gone during high-stakes restoration work, when the adrenaline of the process ate the body's other signals. But the food was genuinely good, and her body apparently had opinions about that overrode the adrenaline, and she found herself eating a reasonable amount of the first course and most of the second before the speeches were scheduled to begin. Damien, beside her, ate steadily and said little. That was normal for him in large social situations. He didn't perform sociability in the way his mother did, had never been naturally comfortable in rooms that required constant navigation, and in this particular room with this particular weight on the evening, he was even quieter than usual. Once, during the second course, he reached under the table and put his hand briefly on her wrist. Not a squeeze, just contact. Just the specific and simple communication of two people who had agreed on something and were in the middle of it together. She put her hand over his for a moment, then the first speaker was introduced, and she moved her hand back. The first two toasts were Damien's college roommate and an aunt from his mother's side who had been allotted 3 minutes and used 7. The roommate was genuine and slightly awkward in the way of someone who had prepared something and was now departing from it in real time, which Naomi found more moving than she'd expected. The aunt talked about Damien's childhood in ways that were probably meant to be charming, and were charming in the way things are charming when they reveal more about the speaker than the subject. Margaret had a toast scheduled. It was third on the program, before the first dance, and it had been a subject of brief discussion during the planning, when Damien had suggested gently that maybe the parents' toast could come later in the evening. Margaret had, with complete pleasantness, explained that tradition placed the family toast early, before the couple's first dance, so that the evening could open with the blessing of the family and proceed from there. Damien had not pushed back. They had let it stand because they needed Margaret's toast to happen where she planned it, in front of the full room, before anything changed. Naomi watched Gerald pass the microphone to Margaret and thought, "Here it is." Margaret stood. In the full light of the ballroom chandelier, in the dove-gray gown that was doing exactly what it had been selected to do, she was formidable. That was the only word. She had the particular formidability of women who have fought for their standing in rooms that didn't automatically offer it, who have calcified that fight into a permanent presentation that no longer requires active effort to maintain because it has become the structure of the person. She was also, Naomi noted, a genuinely effective public speaker. The voice pitched correctly, the pacing controlled, the smile timed to land before and after the moments that required gravity. Damien has always been exceptional, Margaret began. Those of you who have watched him build what he's built, from the early years when he was operating out of a two-room office with a second-hand coffee machine that never actually worked, to what the company is today, you already know that. He doesn't do things by half measures. A brief pause calibrated for warmth. We raised him not to. Polite, appreciative sounds from the room. When he told us he'd found someone, Margaret continued, we were, of course, hopeful. He's not an easy man to know. He doesn't let people close quickly. The fact that he'd let someone close enough to want to stand here with her tonight. She turned her gaze toward Naomi, and the smile she directed at the table was the same practiced warmth she'd deployed all morning. That told us something important. She paused. The room waited. This was the moment in a Mother of the Groom speech where the genuine sentiment was supposed to arrive. It told us how much he wanted it to work, Margaret said. The room heard it as a compliment. Naomi heard the comma that wasn't there, how much he wanted it to work, and how much that wanting could be turned against him. She kept her face completely still. Margaret spoke for 4 more minutes. She was charming. She was composed. She made 2 jokes that landed, referenced 2 stories that humanized Damien without diminishing him, and closed on a sentiment about legacy that the room received warmly. She raised her glass. The room raised theirs. She took her seat with the assurance of a woman who had executed exactly what she intended. The MC moved to the microphone to introduce the next segment of the evening. Naomi stood up. It was not on the program, and the MC hesitated visibly, because MCs at large formal events have a particular relationship with the program, and unscheduled departures from it are processed as errors. He looked at Naomi, then at his printed rundown, then back at Naomi. I'd like to say something, she said, and her voice came out steady and clear in the way voices do when the person speaking has spent 3 weeks preparing for this specific moment. The MC stepped back from the microphone. The room shifted. 312 people resettling their attention toward the woman in the wedding dress who had stood up without being introduced. Damien remained seated beside the empty chair she'd just left. His face was composed. He was watching the room. Naomi reached the microphone stand and adjusted it for her height, which was a small and practical gesture that had the effect of communicating that she intended to be here for a while. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, she said, and I want to thank Margaret Cross for that beautiful toast. She has a gift for speaking in front of people. She always says exactly what she intends to say. She paused. I've learned a great deal about intention, actually, over the past few weeks. The room was listening with the polite attentiveness of large groups waiting to understand what category of thing they were about to witness. I'm a conservator, she continued. I work with old things that have damage in them. The job is reading what you can't see on the surface, understanding how something was made, what was done to it over time, where the breaks are hiding. She looked out at the room. I'm going to share some of what I've been reading. She picked up the remote she'd had placed, at her request, at the head table's position for the speech portion of the evening. She pressed the advance button. The ballroom's screens, 4 of them, positioned for visibility from every table, activated. What appeared first was not the audio recording. She'd made a deliberate choice about sequence. You started with what people could see before you gave them what they could only hear, because comprehension moved that direction, from image to sound, and because the visual evidence was irrefutable in a way that allowed the audio to land in a room that was already beginning to understand what it was hearing. What appeared on the screens was a document, a clean, simple layout, financial transfer records, dates, amounts, account numbers with specific digits redacted and specific digits visible. The header was a corporate account belonging to Cross Family Holdings. The recipient was an account registered to a company called Sienna Consulting LLC. 3 payments, 4 months apart, each one larger than the last. The room was very quiet. Those payments were made to my cousin Sienna Brooks, Naomi said, who is sitting at that table in the blush dress because I asked her to be my maid of honor. She did not look at Sienna. She kept her eyes on the room, the way you kept your eyes on the work rather than the reaction. I'd like to play something for you. She pressed advance. The recording from the library filled the ballroom through the estate's sound system, which had been designed for exactly this kind of projection. A reception hall that needed to carry music and speeches to 300 people without distortion. Margaret's voice arrived clearly, at a volume that left no ambiguity about what was being said or who was saying it. Not after the wedding, the timing is too obvious. It needs to begin before the ink is dry. Sienna understands what's at stake. A pause. Gerald's voice. You're certain she won't get sentimental. Sienna doesn't get sentimental. She gets compensated. Naomi let it run. She watched the room while it played. The specific movement of comprehension across 300 faces. The moment when the pleasant confusion of an unscheduled speech became something else. She saw the table where Sienna was sitting. Sienna had gone very still, the way people go still when the floor has stopped being where they expected it to be. The champagne glass in front of her was untouched. The documents are already prepared. Once the affair is established, and it won't take long, Damien isn't made of stone, we move the fraud evidence to her accounts. By the time she realizes what's happened, the marriage will be in dissolution and she'll be facing charges. Nobody will believe a word she says. And Damien? Damien will be devastated. He'll want someone to blame. He'll blame her. He always chooses the cleaner story. The recording ended. The ballroom was in the specific silence of a room that has received information it is still processing. Naomi advanced to the next slide. The fraud evidence she mentioned was real, she said. It was fabricated, but it was real fabrication, the kind that would have taken a prosecutor months to unravel, during which time I would have been facing charges for financial crimes I didn't commit, in a marriage that had been deliberately destroyed. She advanced again. These are the communications between Margaret Cross and Sienna Brooks, going back 14 months, before Sienna reached out to me, before we reconnected, as she described it, before she suggested herself as my maid of honor. She let the room look at the messages on screen for a moment, the exchange visible, dates visible, content visible. She was hired before she texted me. I was the assignment. She heard a sound from Margaret's table, not a word, a sharp intake of breath or the beginning of one that got controlled. She did not look at Margaret. The financial crimes in this documentation are not fabrications, she continued, moving to the next set of slides. These are 8 months of investigation by an independent forensic accounting firm. What they found in the cross-corporate structure predates my relationship with Damien by more than a decade. It involves multiple subsidiaries, multiple transactions, and multiple individuals. She kept her voice level. She had practiced this particular evenness because she'd known that the room would be watching her face as much as the screens, and the face needed to communicate documentation, not devastation. The investigators have been in contact with the relevant authorities for 6 weeks. Today's presentation provides the final piece of a public record. She advanced to the last slide. It was a single page, clean. The name of the investigating firm, their finding summary, and the contact information for the 2 lead investigators who were, at this moment, standing in the rear of the ballroom. I want to be clear about something, Naomi said, and the room was so quiet that her voice seemed to move through it differently than before, not filling it, but reaching across it. I did not stand up here to humiliate anyone. I stood up here because silence was what this plan required of me, and I've decided I'm not interested in providing it. She set down the remote. Damien and I have a few things to sort out. I imagine everyone does. She stepped back from the microphone. The silence held for another 3 or 4 seconds, the specific suspension of a room that has not yet decided what to do with what it's received. Then she heard Damien's chair. He stood up. He did not look at her first, the way she might have expected. He looked at the room, at the full 300 people he'd grown up performing this family's legacy in front of, and his voice when he spoke was the voice he used in rooms that needed him to be in charge of them, which was not loud but was absolutely present. Everything she's shown you is accurate, he said. I'll add to it. And the room shifted again into something Naomi hadn't entirely calculated for. The specific, electrified attention of 300 people who had come to a wedding and were watching something far more significant occur instead. Margaret Cross said, from her table, with a control that was impressive given the circumstances, Damien, this is not— I know what this is, Mom, he said. He looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just set it down. "I know exactly what this is," he said again. "That's the problem." And the room waited, in the particular stillness of people who understood, collectively, and without anyone saying it, that the next thing said in this room was going to matter very much, to several people, for a very long time. Damian Cross had not prepared a speech. That was the first thing Naomi noticed when he stood. There was no paper, no phone with notes pulled up, no the careful positioning of a man who had rehearsed something. He simply stood, with the particular straightness of someone who had made a decision and was now living inside it. And he looked at the room the way he looked at problems, directly, without the buffer of performance. The room was still making up its mind about what was happening. Naomi could feel it, the specific collective recalibration of 300 people who had arrived with one set of expectations and were now operating without a map. Some of them had their phones out. She'd anticipated that and had decided she didn't care. Let them record. Let there be footage. Documentation had been the foundation of this entire thing, and more documentation was only more foundation. 8 months ago, Damian said, I hired a forensic accounting firm called Meridian Group. I'm going to tell you why. He paused, not for effect. The pause of a man choosing words with the care of someone who has spent a long time being imprecise about painful things and has decided to stop. When I was 31, I incorporated my company with seed capital from my parents, $2 million. I was grateful for it, and I worked to justify it, and over the next 12 years, that company became something that I built. The decisions, the people, the direction, all of it. I built it. His voice was even. What I didn't fully understand until recently is that my parents never stopped treating that initial investment as a controlling stake. Not legally, just in the way they thought about it. From Margaret's table, a sound, the controlled breath of someone managing their response. 3 years ago, Damian continued, I started seeing irregularities in the corporate accounts. Small ones. The kind that when you're running a company at the scale mine was running, you might attribute to accounting complexity or currency fluctuation, or any of the 100 ordinary explanations that exist for things that don't quite add up. I attributed them to that. He looked at a point somewhere in the middle distance of the room. I didn't want to look harder because I didn't want to know what looking harder would find. Nobody moved. I want to be honest about that, he said. I chose not to know. For about 18 months, I chose not to know, and that's on me. He looked down at the table briefly, then back up. When I finally looked, really looked, what I found was that my parents had been using subsidiaries connected to my company to run money through a series of accounts over a period of approximately 11 years. The amounts varied, the methods evolved, the destination was always the same. He let that settle. Their personal holdings, their personal wealth, built on structures that used my company's legitimacy as cover. Gerald Cross, who had been sitting with the expression of a man waiting for a situation to resolve itself without his involvement, finally moved. He shifted forward in his chair and opened his mouth. Damian! His voice had the weight of a man who had spent 60 years being the one whose voice ended conversations. This is not the place. You told me that in your office 6 weeks ago, Damian said. I didn't agree then. I don't agree now. He looked at his father directly. This is exactly the place. These are the people you've spent 40 years asking for legitimacy. They should know what they were legitimizing. Gerald closed his mouth. The room absorbed this. Naomi watched the tables nearest the front, the tables that held the oldest and most connected of the Cross family's social network, and she could see, on those faces, the specific expression of people doing rapid calculations. What did they know? What had they participated in, however tangentially? What did tonight mean for the various entanglements they'd built over decades with a family that had just been publicly exposed? Some of those expressions were very uncomfortable. Damian walked from behind the head table. It was not a planned movement. Naomi saw it for what it was, which was a man who needed to not be sitting down for the next part of what he was going to say. He moved to the small, clear space near the edge of the dance floor, which put him closer to the room, and the room's attention moved with him, the way attention moves when a speaker changes their spatial relationship to the audience. I want to talk about Naomi, he said. He looked at her across the room. She was still standing near the microphone stand, and the distance between them, maybe 30 feet of polished floor, felt both large and very small. I brought her into my life, he said, without telling her what was underneath it. I thought I was protecting her. I thought... He stopped, reconsidered whatever he'd been about to say. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be rationalizations. The honest version is that I was afraid of what would happen if I showed her the full picture. And while I was being afraid, my parents were using that window to set her up. He paused. The fraud documents they were going to plant in her accounts, those were in preparation for 4 months before the wedding. I know that now because my investigators found the preparation trail. They built a case against her before they'd even finished building the case. They had a story ready to tell about a woman they'd decided they didn't want in this family, and they were going to use my company, my name, and the legal system to tell it. The chandelier light caught something in his expression that Naomi had seen before, in private. The specific tightness around his jaw that meant he was managing anger by moving it into precision. I should have told her sooner than I did, he said. She deserved to know what she was walking into, and she deserved to make her own choice about whether to walk into it. I made that decision for her, and it was wrong. And I'm saying that in this room with these people because private apologies for public failures are a form of cowardice I'm trying to stop participating in. He was looking at Naomi when he said it. She didn't look away. She wanted to say something. Wanted to tell him that they had already talked about this, that she understood the difference between his failure and his parents' active malice, that she had made peace with the distinction even if she'd logged it as a thing they'd need to continue addressing. But this was not her moment. He was doing the thing he needed to do, in the way he needed to do it, and she let him. Set. Margaret Cross had been sitting in the specific posture of a woman who was being very careful not to be seen as anything other than composed. It was an impressive posture. It was the posture of someone who had spent decades preparing for rooms to turn, who had always maintained that her position in any room was secure enough to weather whatever the room generated. The color in her face had changed. Something beneath the careful makeup had shifted, like a painting where the ground layer is showing through. But her back was straight, and her chin was level, and her hands were folded on the table in front of her. Damien turned and looked at her. "Mom," he said, just the one word. She met his eyes. Her expression did not collapse. It didn't generate the defensive anger Naomi had half expected, not the wounded indignation of someone who felt wrongly accused. It generated something else, something that took Naomi a moment to name. Assessment. Even now, Margaret was assessing. Running the calculation of what remained, what could be preserved, what the next move was. "You've made your statement," Margaret said. Her voice was controlled. A lesser woman would have broken on the first syllable. She didn't. "I think we should continue this privately." "There's nothing private left," Damien said. "There's always something private left." She held his gaze. "You're my son. Whatever you think of me right now, you're my son, and some things should be said between us without an audience." It was, Naomi had to admit, a well-chosen line. It wasn't an apology. Margaret would not have deployed an apology in this room under any circumstances, because an apology was an admission, and an admission was the end. But it was a call to something real, something that existed between them regardless of everything else, and it was placed with precision. Damien was quiet for a moment. "I spent a long time making private decisions because I thought they were protecting people," he said. "I'm done with that approach." Margaret looked at him for another few seconds. Then, for the first time that evening, something in her posture changed. Not a collapse, nothing so dramatic, but a settling, the way a structure settles when it registers a load it cannot distribute. She looked down at the table. Gerald said, from beside her, in a voice that had lost the authority it had carried 30 seconds ago, "This is going to be in every financial publication by morning." "Yes," Damien said, "it is. You understand what you've done." "I understand what you did," Damien said. "I understand what you've been doing for 11 years. And I understand that I looked away from it for 2 years because it was easier to look away. And during those 2 years, you decided to use that as an opportunity to destroy the person I married." He stopped. "So yes, I understand what I've done. I've ended it." Sienna had not moved since the recording played. She had not moved, had not spoken, had not reached for her champagne glass or her phone or any of the ordinary objects of a person managing an ordinary social difficulty. She was sitting in the blush bridesmaid dress with her hands in her lap, and she was looking at the table in front of her, and she looked like what she was, which was a person whose entire structural position had just been removed from beneath them. One of the investigators, the younger of the two who had been standing in the rear of the ballroom, moved from his position near the wall and walked toward the front of the room. He moved without hurry and without drama, the way people move when they do something regularly enough that urgency would feel strange. He stopped near Sienna's table. She looked up at him. She had the expression of someone who had been waiting for this exact thing to happen and was somehow still surprised that it was happening. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "we'll need to speak with you this evening." Sienna looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked across the room at Naomi. The look she gave Naomi was complicated. Naomi had expected something simpler, defiance or shame, or the blankness of someone in shock. What she got was more human than that, which made it harder. There was something in Sienna's face that might have been an actual apology if the circumstances for an actual apology had existed, the expression of a person who had made a choice a long time ago and had been inside that choice long enough that she'd stopped examining it and was now examining it very suddenly. Naomi held her gaze. She didn't offer anything back, not forgiveness, not contempt, just the steady attention of someone who sees what's there. Sienna looked away first. The room, after Damien stopped speaking, spent about 90 seconds in the fractured state of a large gathering that has lost its organizing structure. People were talking, a few loudly, most in the urgent undertone of people sharing reactions they weren't certain enough of to project. Several people near the periphery of the room had moved toward the exits, not quickly enough to be flight, but with the particular momentum of people who had decided the room was no longer somewhere they wanted to be when the next development arrived. 3 women at a table near the windows were speaking in the tight cluster of people who knew each other well and were processing something together. A man near the bar, someone Naomi recognized vaguely as a cross-business associate, had his phone to his ear and was speaking with his body turned toward the wall. The string quartet in the corner had stopped playing at some point during Damien's remarks and hadn't started again. The 4 musicians were sitting with their instruments and looking at each other with the slightly lost expression of people who had a very specific job and no longer had a context in which to do it. The estate's event manager appeared at Naomi's elbow, a thin man named Paul who had been coordinating the estate's event logistics for years and who was maintaining his professional composure with the specific effort of someone who had never in those years been required to maintain it this hard. "Mrs. Cross," he said, and then stopped because she was technically Mrs. Cross as of about 3 hours ago, and also that was complicated, and both of them felt the complication. "Naomi is fine," she said. "Right. Yes." He exhaled. Can I ask what you need from the staff right now? In terms of, I want to make sure we're supporting whatever needs to happen next." She appreciated that he'd asked rather than assuming. "The investigators need a private room," she said. "Somewhere they can speak with people separately. Is the East study available?" "I can have it cleared in 5 minutes." "Thank you." He nodded and moved because having something specific and logistical to do was clearly a relief. She turned to find Damien at her shoulder. "The investigators want the documents formally handed over," he said. "Their legal counsel is on the way. It'll be another 40 minutes at minimum before they're ready to proceed with anything official." "Are your parents going to try to leave?" He glanced toward his parents' table. Gerald had stood and was speaking with a man in a dark suit whom Naomi didn't recognize. Margaret had not stood. She was still at the table, still upright, still arranged in the posture she'd arrived in, though the room around her had rearranged itself completely. "They won't try to leave," Damien said. "Gerald is talking to their attorney. Mom knows that leaving would read badly." He paused. "She still thinks there's a version of this where she manages the outcome." "Is there?" "No," he said, without uncertainty, without the complicated ambivalence that had characterized how he'd talked about his parents for the 2 years she'd known him. "Just no." She looked at him. "How are you doing?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he applied to questions he wasn't going to answer carelessly. "I'm okay. He stopped. "I knew what tonight was going to be. I've known for 4 days. And it's still different to actually be in it." "Yes," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "That's not a deflection. I'm actually fine." He looked at her. "You?" "Ask me in an hour," she said. He almost smiled. "Not quite." The circumstances were not almost smile circumstances, but close enough that she felt it. Across the room, Margaret Cross stood up. She did not look at Damien, did not look at Naomi, did not make eye contact with any of the guests who were now watching her with the undisguised attention of people who had decided to stop pretending they weren't watching. She simply stood, straightened the front of her dress with one precise movement, and walked toward the exit that led to the estate's interior corridor. One of the investigators moved to intercept her before she reached the door. "Mrs. Cross," he said, "I'd ask that you remain in the room for now." She stopped. She looked at him with the expression she used on people who occupied a tier she did not believe included authority over her. "I'm going to the restroom," she said. "I'll have someone escort you," he said, and the pleasantness of his voice was the practiced pleasantness of someone who had done this particular thing enough times to have developed a specific register for it. Something crossed Margaret's face. Not humiliation. She was several steps from humiliation, and might never actually arrive there, which was not a judgment, but simply an observation about the kind of person she was. What crossed her face was the recognition of a thing she had not previously had to recognize, that she was not, at this particular moment, in a position to simply decline. She looked at the investigator for a moment. Then she looked back at the room, at the tables, the guests, the chandelier light bouncing off wine glasses and silverware, the entire curated environment that she had spent decades building and that was now occupied by people watching her navigate something she couldn't navigate her way out of. Then she walked with the investigator to the east study, and the door closed behind her. The next hour was not dramatic in the way the previous half hour had been dramatic. It was the harder kind of drama, the administrative procedural drama of a situation that had moved past its breaking point and was now in the part that required paperwork. The investigators worked methodically. They used the East study for the formal conversations and a smaller room off the main corridor for the document transfer. Two people from what appeared to be a legal team arrived. They had the look of people who had been called at an inconvenient time and had come anyway, because that was the arrangement. The guests sorted themselves into categories. A substantial portion had left within the first 20 minutes after Damien's remarks. Not all of them, and not the ones who were directly connected to the business or legal elements of what had been disclosed. Several of those people remained, some of them because they'd been asked to, and some of them because they had their own interests in what was being documented. 3 journalists whom Naomi had not recognized as journalists turned out to be journalists. She found out later that 2 of them were business reporters who had been on the Cross family's social list for years, and who had come tonight as guests and were leaving with something considerably more significant than they'd arrived with. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She hadn't accounted for journalists in the planning, and she probably should have. But it was also true that what she and Damien had done tonight was specifically designed to be visible. You couldn't choose visibility and then be surprised that visible things were seen. A woman named Caroline, who had been seated at the 3rd table from the front, and who turned out to be a longtime friend of the Cross family, made her way through the partially emptied room and stopped in front of Naomi. She was perhaps 70, silver-haired, wearing the quiet jewelry of someone who didn't need to announce themselves. "I've known Margaret Cross for 30 years, she said, not as a defense, more in the tone of someone stating a fact that now required recontextualization. "I know," Naomi said, because Damien had pointed her out during the seating chart discussion. "I've liked her for most of them," Caroline continued. "I've also known, for most of them, that there were things I wasn't seeing." She was quiet for a moment. "I never asked to see them." Naomi didn't say anything. "I'm not asking for absolution," Caroline said. "I just want you to know that what you did tonight, the way you did it, that required something." She paused. "I'm sorry for my part in not asking better questions earlier." It was, Naomi thought, a more honest statement than she'd expected to receive tonight from anyone in this room. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." Caroline nodded once and moved away. Gerald Cross was the first of them to be formally questioned. He went into the East study at approximately 6:15 with his attorney beside him and came out 40 minutes later looking like a man who had aged several years in the interval. He did not look at Damien on his way through the room. He looked at the floor and then at a middle distance and then at the floor again. And he walked to the chair at his own table and sat down heavily and didn't move for a long time. Damien watched his father sit down. He had the expression of someone who had made peace with something and was discovering that making peace with something and actually feeling peaceful were not the same experience. Naomi put her hand on his arm. He looked down at her hand. Then he put his own hand over it, briefly. "He's not a stupid man," Damien said quietly. "He's always known what she was doing. He just decided early on that it was easier to let her run things than to have a position of his own." He stopped. "I've spent a long time thinking that made him less responsible. I don't think that anymore." "Knowing and not stopping it," Naomi said. "Yeah," he said. "Knowing and not stopping it." Tam. Sienna was questioned third, after one of the Cross family's financial advisors who had been present at the wedding and who had, it turned out, been aware of at least the peripheral elements of the subsidiary arrangement. He came out of the study looking like a man who had just made several rapid calculations about legal exposure and had not liked the results. Sienna went in with no attorney. She hadn't arrived at the wedding with one, because she hadn't known she would need one tonight, because nobody had told her that Naomi knew. She came out 40 minutes later looking like someone who had made a decision in the room. Naomi couldn't tell what decision. Sienna's face had shed the performance of warmth that had been its default presentation for 18 months, and what was underneath was harder to read. Not hard exactly, but more raw, less managed, the face of someone who was done managing. She stopped when she saw Naomi. The room around them had thinned considerably. It was not the same room it had been 3 hours ago. The chandelier light was the same. The ivory tablecloths were the same. The flowers were still there in their measured arrangements, but the energy of the space had completely shifted, the way a restored painting changes in character once the varnish is removed and the actual surface is visible. "I know you don't want to hear this," Sienna said. "You don't know what I want," Naomi said. Not harshly, just accurately. Sienna accepted that. "I was broke," she said. "Actually broke. Not embarrassed about money broke. The apartment I told you I was between. I'd been evicted 3 months before I texted you. I was staying with someone I didn't want to be staying with. And then I got a call from a consultant who worked for Gerald Cross's personal office, asking if I knew you and telling me what they needed." She paused. "I knew it was wrong. I want to say I didn't, but I knew." Naomi looked at her. "You don't have to tell me this," Naomi said. "I know." Sienna's voice was not asking for anything. It was just tired. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I want you to know that I liked you, genuinely. The actual time we spent together, the conversations we had, I wasn't performing that." She stopped. "I was performing everything around it, but not that. I know that probably doesn't matter." "It doesn't fix it," Naomi said. "It's also true. Both those things can be true." Sienna looked at her for a moment. "You're less—" She stopped, started again. "I expected you to be angrier." "I'm angry," Naomi said. "I'm also tired, and I have a lot left to deal with tonight, and being angry at you specifically right now requires more energy than I currently have for it." Something moved in Sienna's expression. Not relief. Nothing as clean as relief. Just the complicated response of someone who has received honesty when they expected performance. "I'm going to cooperate with them," Sienna said. "Fully. Whatever they need." Naomi nodded. "Good." Sienna looked like she wanted to say something else. She didn't. She walked toward the exit, and then she was gone, and Naomi stood in the partial room with the flowers and the chandelier and let herself be still for a moment. She was angry. That part was true. She was angry at Sienna and at Margaret, and at the casual certainty with which the plan had been constructed, the assumption that Naomi would be passive, would be findable, would be too trusting to look below the surface. The anger was not hot. It was the cold, banked anger of someone who has already used the productive version of it and is now just carrying the remainder. She thought, "I was supposed to be destroyed by this." She thought, "I wasn't." Those two facts were not yet comfortable alongside each other. They would take time to settle into the shape of something she could carry normally. But they were both true, and true was what she had wanted to work with from the beginning, and at least that much was now in place. Margaret came out of the East study at 7:40. She came out alone. Her attorney remained in the study for further conversation with the investigators. She came out with the same posture she'd carried all day, which was astonishing in its way. Not defiance. Defiance would have been too combustible to maintain. Something more durable and more troubling. The bearing of a woman who had processed what had happened and sorted it into a category she could manage, even if the contents of the category were catastrophic. She looked around the room. Most of what remained of the guests were people with business or legal connections to the situation. The kind of people who stayed because leaving would mean conceding that they had no stake in the outcome. A few of the estate staff were quietly clearing the tables that were clearly not returning to use tonight. Margaret's eyes found Damien. She walked toward him. Naomi was standing beside him. She didn't move. Margaret stopped a few feet away and looked at her son with an expression that Naomi had not seen on her face before. Not the assessment, not the performed warmth, not the certainty. Something underneath all of those things. Whether it was genuine, whether any of this could produce something genuine in a woman who had been performing for so long that the performance and the person had merged, Naomi could not say. Maybe Margaret herself couldn't say. "I made choices," Margaret said. "I'm aware of that." "Yes," Damien said. "I made them because I wanted to protect what we built." "You made them because you wanted to control what I built," he said. "There's a difference. I need you to know that I understand the difference." Margaret was quiet. "I'm not going to call you tonight," he said. "I don't know when I'll call you. I need you to not be someone I need to manage right now." He paused. "I need to figure out who I am in a version of my family that doesn't include this. And I can't do that if I'm also trying to manage your feelings about it." It was not a cruel statement. It was a frank one. The cruelty and the frankness can look similar from outside, and Naomi suspected that to several people still in the room they looked identical. But she knew the difference because she knew Damien, and what she was hearing was not a son punishing a mother, but a man describing his own limits with the precision of someone who has finally located where those limits actually are. Margaret looked at him for a long time. "I wanted more for you than starting from nothing," she said. "I know," he said. "I didn't need that. I needed you to let me build what I built without a hand in it that I didn't know about." He stopped. "I would have given you anything you asked for. You knew that. You chose not to ask." Margaret's jaw tightened fractionally, the nearest thing to visible pain she had permitted herself all evening. "We'll speak again," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Eventually." She looked at Naomi then. The look she gave Naomi was not hostile. Hostility would have meant she was still fighting, and Margaret Cross was, at this particular moment, done fighting. What she gave Naomi was something approaching straight assessment, the look of a woman who had underestimated something and knew it. She didn't speak to Naomi. She turned and walked back toward the east corridor, where the investigators and her attorney were waiting, and the door closed behind her, and the room she left behind was quieter than it had been all evening. Damien stood looking at the closed door for a moment. "Okay," he said quietly. Not to Naomi specifically, just okay. The word you say when you've done a thing you needed to do and your body is trying to register that it's done. "Okay," Naomi said back. They stood in the remains of the reception, the half-cleared tables, the flowers that were still perfect because flowers didn't know what had happened around them, the chandelier burning away over a room that had been set for 312 people and now contained perhaps 30. And neither of them said anything for a while. The string quartet was gone. At some point during the evening, they had packed their instruments and left, which was reasonable. There was no music. Naomi thought about the first dance that was still on the program she was holding, which she hadn't looked at since before the ceremony. It was printed on heavy cream cardstock with raised lettering, the kind of program that communicated the importance of an occasion. The first dance, Damien and Naomi, and then the family, and then the floor opened. She had the program still because she'd been holding it when she went to the microphone and had tucked it against her side and somehow held onto it through all of it, which was the kind of small, absurd thing that happened in situations where the body was running on automatic and hadn't registered that certain objects were no longer relevant. She looked at it now. Then she looked up at Damien. "We never danced," she said. He looked at her, looked at the program in her hand, looked at the empty dance floor with its polished wood surface, empty of everything now, the space where 300 people had been, or were supposed to have been. "No," he said. "We didn't." The room was very quiet. Whatever came next was going to come next, and it was going to be long and complicated, and neither of them was naive about that. There were still investigators in the East Study, There were still documents to be formally processed. There were still calls to be made and statements to be given, and the whole structural work of a situation that had moved from private to very, very public in the space of an evening. But right now, in the specific pocket of quiet between what had just happened and what came next, they were two people standing in a room that had been designed to celebrate them, and the celebration had not gone as designed, and they were still standing. That was something. They didn't dance that night. It wasn't a decision they made consciously. There was no moment where either of them said, "Not tonight," or maybe later. It simply didn't happen. The way many planned things didn't happen in the wake of what the evening had become. The floor stayed empty. The program with its raised cream lettering stayed in Naomi's hand and then got set down somewhere on a cleared table, and at some point it got swept up with the rest of the linen and the remaining centerpiece materials. And that was the end of it. What they did instead was sit. There was a small room off the east corridor, not the study where the investigators had been working, a different one, smaller, set up as a waiting area with two sofas and a low table and a lamp that produced the kind of warm, inadequate light that felt appropriate for 10 o'clock on the night your wedding had become something else. One of the estate staff had quietly set a tray there, coffee, water, what appeared to be the remains of the appetizer course in a covered dish. The practical recognition that two people who had been in a sustained high-stakes situation for several hours probably needed to eat something. Naomi ate 3 of the small pastry things without tasting them, and then drank half a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cool and stared at the wall. Damien sat on the other sofa with his jacket off and his tie loosened and his elbows on his knees, and also stared at the wall. After a while he said, "How's your head?" "Tired," she said. "Functional." "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mine too." The lead investigator knocked and came in at 10:20 to tell them that the formal documentation transfer was complete, that both Margaret and Gerald Cross had been formally notified of the pending charges, and that their attorneys had been provided with the relevant materials. Gerald had left the estate 20 minutes earlier with his attorney. Margaret was still in a separate room with hers. "Will they be arrested tonight?" Naomi asked. "Not tonight," he said. "The charges are filed. The process from here is standard procedure. They'll be required to surrender within a specified window. Their travel will be flagged, and their attorneys will manage the formal surrender. Given their profile, we'd expect compliance rather than flight." "Because flight would look worse," Damien said. "In their circumstances, yes." Damien nodded at the table. "And Sienna Brooks?" "Ms. Brooks has agreed to full cooperation. She'll be formally charged, but given the cooperation agreement and the fact that she was not the architect of the scheme, the exposure is significantly lower. Her attorney joined her about an hour ago." The investigator paused. "She asked me to tell you, both of you, that she's sorry. I'm passing that on without endorsement or recommendation." Naomi said, "I know." The investigator looked at her with the careful neutrality of someone who dealt in facts rather than feelings and was respecting the boundary of his lane. "Is there anything else you need from us tonight?" "No," Damien said. "Thank you, genuinely." The investigator nodded and withdrew, and the door clicked shut, and they were alone again in the inadequate lamplight with the half-eaten appetizer tray. "Sienna is going to have a hard time," Naomi said. Not with sympathy exactly. Not without it either. "She made the choices she made," Damien said. "She did. People also make choices inside circumstances, and her circumstances were—" Naomi stopped. "It doesn't excuse it. It's also true." Damien looked at her. "You're more charitable than I am right now." "I'm not being charitable," she said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." She set her coffee cup down. "I'm angry at her. I'm going to be angry at her for a while. Those things can coexist with understanding what pushed her into it." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about the champagne glass," he said. She looked at him. "In the dressing suite," he said. "You photographed it." "Yes." "Did you ever find out if there was anything in it?" "I sent the photographs to one of the investigators 3 days ago, along with the description of when it was placed and how it was positioned. He told me this afternoon that without the actual glass there was no way to test it, but that the placement and timing were consistent with the pattern." She paused. "I don't know. I may never know. I do know I wasn't going to drink it." Damien let out a slow breath. "If you had," he said, "if you hadn't thought to photograph it, if you'd drunk it and it had been something—" "I didn't," she said. I didn't because I'd been paying attention for 3 weeks and I knew enough not to. But if you hadn't known, Damien. She said it gently but clearly. We can go down that road all night and find nothing at the end of it. I knew. I didn't drink it. That's the version that happened. He looked at her. The expression on his face was one she recognized. The expression of someone whose mind was running the alternate scenarios compulsively, the way minds do when something has gone well but could have gone badly, rehearsing the near miss rather than the outcome. You're doing the thing where you punish yourself for what could have happened instead of dealing with what did, she said. Yeah, he said. I know. Stop. I'm trying. She got up from her sofa and sat down on his. Not dramatically. She just moved, the way you move when the physical distance between yourself and another person stops making sense. She sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a while, not saying anything, in the small room with the inadequate light, wearing their wedding clothes, on what had turned out to be their wedding night. The estate staff began the careful process of closing down the event at around 11. There was a professional quality to it that Naomi, even exhausted, appreciated. The quiet efficiency of people who had learned to restore environments to their pre-event state without drawing attention to the fact that they were doing so. Tables were cleared, flowers were moved to the staff area where they would be distributed or discarded tomorrow. The AV system was disconnected and the screens retracted into their ceiling housings. The champagne that hadn't been drunk, which was a substantial portion given the evening's trajectory, was moved back to storage. The estate's general manager came to find them at 11:15. His name was Howard, and he had been managing this property for 16 years, and he looked like someone who had seen many things in those years and was attempting to process tonight as one of them without entirely succeeding. I want to express on behalf of the estate staff that He stopped, recalibrated. I don't have the right words for tonight. I want to make sure you have everything you need, and I want you to know that whatever I can do to support you in the coming days, I will. Thank you, Howard, Damien said. The East Wing guest rooms are available if you'd like to stay tonight rather than travel. Given, Howard gestured slightly at the totality of the evening without specifying any of it. Damien and Naomi looked at each other. We'll go to the city, Damien said. He looked at Naomi. Unless you want to stay. No, she said. Not with hostility toward the estate itself, just the clear knowledge that sleeping in a place where this had happened was not what she needed tonight. The city is right, Howard nodded and arranged for the car. On their way out through the main entrance, past the marble entry hall, past the portrait of Gerald Cross's father that had always looked to Naomi like a man doing an impression of someone confident, past the front desk where 2 staff members were stationed and who both looked at the floor as Damien and Naomi walked by, not rudely, but with the specific avoidance of people who didn't know what expression to offer. Margaret appeared. She was coming from the direction of the east corridor, presumably from the room where she'd been with her attorney. She was wearing a light coat over her gown, as if she'd been preparing to leave. She stopped when she saw them. The 3 of them occupied the entry hall for a moment. Margaret looked at Naomi first. The assessment look again, but different than it had been earlier in the evening. Not calculating, not measuring for vulnerability, just looking. The look of someone who was seeing a thing they decided not to see before, and was seeing it now because there was nothing left to not see. Then she looked at Damien. I'm leaving with Warren, she said. Warren was her attorney. He's advising that I not... She stopped, started again. I won't be in contact until the attorneys have established a protocol. Okay, Damien said. I want to say something, she said. He waited. What I told Gerald when we were planning this, that you always choose the cleaner story. She paused. The lines in her face were more visible now than they'd been all day, which was probably exhaustion and probably also just the removing of layers. I believe that. I built the entire thing on believing that. She looked at him steadily. I was wrong. It was not an apology. An apology would have required an acknowledgement of harm caused, and Margaret Cross was either not capable of that tonight or had been advised not to go near it in the presence of witnesses. But it was, Naomi thought, the closest thing to genuine that Margaret had managed all evening. The admission not of wrong action, but of wrong calculation. The concession of a strategist rather than a mother. But maybe it was all she had. Damien looked at his mother for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, "you were." Margaret nodded once. Then she walked past them toward the front door, and her attorney materialized from somewhere and fell into step beside her, and the door opened and they were gone, and the entry hall was quiet. Damien stood looking at the closed door. Naomi stood beside him. "That was not an apology," she said. "I know what it was," he said. "Is it enough for tonight?" He thought about it honestly. "It's what tonight produced. I'm not going to decide tonight if it's enough." She nodded. That was the right answer. That was actually the right answer for both of them. To let tonight be what it was, and not require it to also settle every question it had generated. Their car arrived, and they left. The drive to the city took 40 minutes. Naomi watched the road through the window and let her mind run without trying to direct it, which was the only way she'd ever been able to decompress after sustained concentration. You had to let the thoughts move through rather than organizing them into something, because organizing them was just more work, and the work needed to stop. What moved through was the day in pieces. The dressing suite in the morning, Sienna's champagne glass on the vanity table, the walk down the aisle with the divided attention, surface track, deep track, both running. Damien's face when she came into his sight line, Margaret's toast, the timing of it, the precision, her own voice at the microphone, which she could hear in memory with a slight unreality, the voice of someone she recognized as herself, but who had done something she hadn't entirely expected herself to be capable of. Sienna's face when the recording played. Gerald saying, "You understand what you've done." Damien saying, "I understand what you did." Margaret, in the entry hall. "I was wrong. Not enough. Not nothing." She thought about what came next, which was a thing she'd been not thinking since the ceremony because there had been no room for it. What came next was complicated in the specific way of things that had been in motion for a long time, and whose motion was not going to stop simply because the acute crisis had passed. There would be legal proceedings, and those would take time. Months, probably, possibly longer. There would be press, because there was already press, because journalists had been in the room, and because a story about a billionaire's wedding becoming the public exposure of his parents' 11-year fraud scheme was not a story that stayed quiet. There would be the company, which Damien would need to stabilize, because the public nature of tonight's revelations had not only exposed the Cross family's crimes, but had also thrown a spotlight on the corporate structures connected to them, and investors and partners and employees would all need managing in the specific, careful way of people who needed to believe the ground was still solid. And there would be the two of them, the marriage that had started with a different kind of ceremony than anyone had planned, in a room that had been used for something other than celebration. The marriage that was real. She was certain of that, certain in the specific way she was certain of things she'd examined from multiple angles over a long period of time, but that was also beginning under conditions that were going to require both of them to do considerable work. She was not someone who was afraid of work. She'd married someone who was not afraid of work. That was, she thought, probably the most functional foundation they could have. Damien was on his phone beside her, dealing with something work-adjacent, speaking quietly in the clipped shorthand of a man who has mastered the ability to manage professional crises in whatever pocket of time is available. She let him. She looked at the road. They arrived at the apartment, his apartment, which had become their apartment 3 months ago when she'd officially moved in, and which still had not quite finished the transition, her things integrated but not yet fully naturalized, at 12:40. The apartment was quiet. Her cat, a gray tabby named Morris, who had opinions about most things, appeared from the direction of the bedroom and conducted a brief investigation of their feet and then retreated to the windowsill. Morris did not care about weddings or revelations or the legal proceedings of the Cross family. This was, Naomi felt, healthy. She took off her shoes in the entryway and then spent about 45 seconds trying to reach the zipper at the back of her dress before Damien, who had already taken his jacket and tie off and draped them over the chair he always used for that purpose, came over and unzipped it without being asked, and then went to the kitchen, and she heard the sound of water being run and the particular clunk of their kettle being filled. She stood in the entryway for a moment. The dress was very beautiful. She had spent a significant amount of time choosing it, and she had been entirely correct about it, and she was also very ready to not be wearing it. She carried it to the bedroom and changed, and came back out in the clothes that were not a wedding dress, which was its own particular relief. Damien handed her tea when she reached the kitchen. It was the right tea. She had a specific hierarchy of teas for different situations, which he had learned without being taught in the way he learned things she hadn't explicitly told him by paying attention. Tonight's tea was the right one. "Thank you," she said. "Yeah." They sat at the kitchen table. Morris reappeared and got up on the third chair, the one that had become his chair through a process of unilateral decision-making, and arranged himself on it and watched them with the complete comfort of a being who knew he was in his correct place. "I keep going over the moment at the microphone," Naomi said. Damien looked at her. "Not in a bad way, just replaying it. The moment before I pressed play on the recording, there was about 2 seconds where I thought, what if I missed something? What if there's a gap in it that I didn't see? Was there? No. Then the 2 seconds were just adrenaline. Yes, but they were very present 2 seconds." She turned her tea mug. "I've had that moment in conservation work. The moment before you do the thing you can't undo. You've done everything you can to prepare, you've checked everything you can check, and then there's still that window where the preparation doesn't feel like enough because the stakes are real, and real stakes don't care how well you prepared." He was watching her with the attention she'd recognized at their first meeting, the specific, undivided kind. "You went ahead anyway," he said. "You go ahead anyway," she said. "That's what the preparation is for, not to eliminate the uncertainty, to give you enough of a foundation that you can move through the uncertainty without stopping." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what I said in the ballroom," he said, "about not telling you sooner, letting you go into this without the full picture." "Damien, let me finish," he said, not sharply. "I'm not revisiting it to punish myself. I'm revisiting it because I need to understand it clearly. Because if I don't understand it clearly, I'll make the same kind of mistake again, and it'll be a different thing, but it'll be the same failure mode." He looked at his mug. "I chose to protect you from something by making a decision for you about what you could handle. I do that. I've done it in work contexts, and I've done it personally, and I think I've always told myself it was consideration, and I think tonight showed me it was actually control." She looked at him. "Not malicious control," he said. "Not my parents' version, but still control." She let that sit for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to try to stop doing that." "Okay," she said. "I'm going to fail sometimes." "You're going to fail sometimes," she agreed. "And then you're going to do what you just did, which is notice and name it without waiting to be called on it." She paused. "That's actually better than most people manage." He looked at her. "I'm not absolved by effort," he said. "No, but effort matters. Effort is what makes the difference between a flaw and a pattern." He was quiet. Outside, the city made its city sounds. The specific ambient register of 12:45 on a weeknight. Traffic diminished to a presence rather than a roar. The occasional distant sound of something, nowhere specific. "We're going to have a hard few months," he said. "Yes. The company is going to be complicated. There are people inside it who knew enough to be concerned, and I need to find out who they are and what they knew, and it's going to create a lot of instability." "I know. And the legal process is going to produce a lot of press. And we're going to be in that press, and I'm going to need to be very carefully public about some things while being very carefully private about others, and I'm not good at that particular combination." "You're better at it than you think." "Maybe." He turned his mug. "I'm not trying to give you a list of warnings. I just want to be honest with you about what I see coming instead of letting you find out by walking into it." She looked at him. "That's new," she said. He half smiled. "Not quite. Circumstances. But close. Yeah, I'm trying something new." The first call came at 7 the next morning. It was from Damien's head of communications, a woman named Priya who had been handling media for the company for 3 years and who was, Naomi had gathered, extraordinarily competent in the specific way of people who operate permanently in crisis conditions and have developed both skill and a kind of professional armor. Priya had seen the reporting that had already gone out. 2 major business publications had pieces live, one from the journalist who'd been in the room, one from a reporter who had obtained the documentation through sources Priya was still identifying, and she needed Damien on a call within the hour. Damien took the call in the second bedroom that served as his home office. Naomi heard the low, continuous register of his voice through the wall while she made coffee and fed Morris and looked at her own phone. She had 47 messages, some from the museum colleagues who'd been at the wedding, most from numbers she didn't recognize, a few from people she knew peripherally through Damien's world who were variously expressing support or asking questions that were really asking for information. She scrolled through without responding to most of them. There was one from Mrs. Patton, her neighbor, who was 71 and had been given a late-arriving invitation and had not, in the end, been able to come due to a knee that had been acting up. The message said, "Naomi, I don't understand most of what I'm reading, but I want you to know I'm here. Morris is welcome here anytime. Call me when you can." Naomi read that one twice and felt something in her chest that was not grief and was not relief, but was in the territory of both. The specific feeling of encountering something uncomplicated and genuine in the middle of complicated. She typed back, "Thank you. I'll call later." She drank her coffee and looked out the window at the morning, which was doing the ordinary things mornings did. Light coming in at its morning angle. City sounds resuming their daytime register. A pigeon on the building ledge opposite doing whatever it was pigeons were doing. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. Then it buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Caroline Marsh. I was at the wedding last night. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I have information I think you and Damien should have about the history of the financial arrangements. I'm not interested in press. I'd like to speak with you privately when you're ready." Naomi looked at that for a moment. Caroline Marsh, the silver-haired woman who had stopped her in the ballroom. 30 years of Margaret's social orbit, something she hadn't asked to see. She forwarded the text to Damien with no comment. His response came back in 3 minutes. "I know who she is. She may actually be useful. Can you set something up for next week?" She typed back, "Yes." The story broke fully by midday. Not just the financial publications. By noon, it was in the general news cycle, the specific kind of story that moved fast because it had all the elements: money, family, a wedding, a public exposure with documentation, 300 witnesses. It was being described in various versions depending on the publication's angle. A fraud story, a family drama, a story about a woman who turned her own wedding into an investigation. The descriptions of Naomi ranged from heroic to calculating, sometimes within the same piece, which was the nature of public narrative, and which she'd expected but which still produced a physical response. The specific discomfort of being characterized by people who had not been present for any of the actual experience. Damien's communications team put out a statement at 2 p.m. Naomi had reviewed it the night before. It had been drafted by Priya and refined by the legal team and said what it needed to say in the precise and bounded language of corporate communications, acknowledging the events, confirming the cooperation with authorities, expressing commitment to full transparency in the investigation, declining further comment pending legal proceedings. It mentioned Naomi once, in the context of her role in identifying the scheme, and it did not characterize her further than that, which was what she'd asked for. She spent most of the day at the apartment. She answered the messages that needed answering and left the ones that didn't. She called her department head at the museum, a practical woman named Dr. Ellison, who led with logistics rather than sympathy, but made both available. And they had a brief, efficient conversation about Naomi's schedule for the following week, which would need to be adjusted, and about the restoration project she'd had to table in the final weeks of wedding planning, which could be resumed. "The Hartley piece is still in holding," Dr. Ellison said. "The delamination isn't worsening. Take whatever time you need." "Next week," Naomi said. "I'll be back next week." "There's no rush. I know. I want to come back." She paused. "I need something that's about the actual work." Dr. Ellison, who understood this, said, "Monday then. Call if that changes." 3 days after the wedding, Naomi got a call from the lead investigator. He told her that both Margaret and Gerald Cross had formally surrendered to the authorities that morning, as expected. The charges against them included wire fraud, tax evasion across multiple entities, and conspiracy. The full weight of 11 years of documented activity rendered into legal language and formally entered into a process that would take considerably longer than 11 years to resolve. Their attorneys had arranged the surrender in the most controlled manner available, which was the right of people with the resources to control such things, and which changed nothing about what they were surrendering to. Sienna Brooks surrendered separately this morning as well, he added. As agreed. I know, Naomi said. Her attorney contacted me. A brief pause. She asked that you be told. I was told. She sat with that after she hung up. Sienna surrendering separately, her attorney making sure Naomi knew. It was not absolution, and it was not enough. And it was also something. The smallest possible gesture of a person trying to exist with a measure of accountability in conditions that made accountability very uncomfortable. She filed it alongside the other things she was filing in the category of things that were true, but not yet settled. Damien came home at 7 that evening carrying takeout containers and looking like a man who had spent the day doing the hardest version of his job. He set the containers on the table and took off his jacket and ran both hands through his hair, which was his specific physical tell for a day that had required more than it was supposed to. How bad? She asked. Not catastrophic, he said. Complicated. He sat down. 3 board members want an emergency meeting. 2 of them are supportive. They want to talk about stabilization. One of them is calculating his own exposure, and I'm going to have to manage that carefully. He opened one of the containers. Priya says the press cycle will shift in about 72 hours. Right now, we're the story. Then the next thing becomes the story. Is she usually right about that? Almost always. He looked up. She also said your name is in more pieces than mine. I know. How are you feeling about it? She considered. I don't love it. I understand why it's happening. I went to a microphone in front of 300 people. I can't be surprised that people have things to say about that. She paused. Some of what they're saying is wrong. I don't have a way to correct all of it without making it larger. Priya can... I know what Priya can do. I'm not ready to make it larger. She looked at him. I will need to say something publicly at some point. Something that's mine and not a corporate statement, but not yet. He looked at her steadily. What do you want it to say? I don't know yet. When I know, I'll tell you. He nodded, not a provisional nod. The nod of someone who genuinely accepted that and wasn't going to push for a faster resolution. She noticed it. She noticed the difference between that and how he might have handled it a week ago, and she thought about what he'd said at the kitchen table. I'm trying something new. He was trying. It was imperfect and early and not yet natural, and it was trying. The estate, he said, after they'd eaten for a while. I need to make a decision about it. She looked at him. It's in my parents' name technically, but the funding for its maintenance has come from corporate accounts for years, and that's going to be examined as part of the asset review. He turned his fork. It may end up in the asset pool regardless of what I decide, but if I have a decision to make about it independently, he stopped. I don't want to live there. I've never wanted to live there. I want to be done with it. Then be done with it, she said. There are staff, he said. People who've worked there for years. Howard has been there 16 years. Then be done with it in a way that accounts for them. He looked at her. You say that like it's obvious, he said. It is obvious. It's just not always easy. He was quiet for a moment. I grew up in that house, he said. Not happily, mostly, but I grew up there. He paused. I thought I felt more about that than I apparently do. Maybe you've been feeling it for years, she said. Maybe you've already used up most of the feeling about it, and this is what's left. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand as the expression of someone who has been given a useful frame for something that had previously been formless. Maybe, he said. 2 weeks after the wedding, Naomi went back to the museum. She went on a Monday morning, as she'd told Dr. Ellison she would, and she took the subway rather than a car because she wanted the normality of the subway, the ordinary experience of being among people moving from one place to another for ordinary reasons. A woman next to her was reading something on her phone. A man in a work vest was sleeping against the window. A child across the car was asking its father a question about something outside that Naomi couldn't hear the answer to. She got off at her stop and walked the 3 blocks to the museum's staff entrance, which she'd walked 300 times, which was a door she could find in the dark, and she went in and said good morning to the security desk and went to the conservation lab. The Hartley piece was in its holding bay, exactly as Dr. Ellison had said. She stood in front of it for a long time before she touched anything. It was a mid-sized oil, early 20th century, landscape with figures. The delamination she'd identified before the wedding had not progressed. The paint layer in the upper left quarter was still lifting at the edges, still holding a fragile relationship to the ground beneath it, still in the specific suspended condition of a damaged thing that had been stabilized but not yet repaired. Still waiting. She pulled on her gloves, she adjusted the task lamp, she prepared the consolidant and the tools she would need for the first pass. She thought about something she'd said to Damien weeks ago, in his office, when they'd been talking about what was underneath the surface of his family. She'd said that the job was reading damage that hid itself, that you trained yourself not to trust the first reading. She thought, yes, but the other part of the job is the repair. The reading was necessary. The documentation was necessary. The painstaking process of identifying what had been done and building a record of it, all of it necessary, and she was good at it, and it had served her when she'd needed it to serve her. But the thing she'd spent 11 years actually doing, the core of it, the part that required the patience nobody else had developed, was not the reading. It was the repair. The careful, slow, unglamorous work of returning something damaged to a condition where it could exist safely in the world. Not perfect. Conservation was not restoration to some imagined original. It was stabilization. It was the honest acknowledgement of what had happened and the careful reduction of its most destructive effects. You didn't pretend the damage hadn't occurred. You treated it so the damage stopped progressing. She thought, that is actually a reasonable frame for the next year of my life. She picked up her tools and began. Damien called at noon. She stepped out of the lab to take the call, standing in the corridor with her gloves off and her phone at her ear, and he told her that the emergency board meeting had gone better than expected. The two supportive members had managed the agenda effectively. A stabilization plan had been agreed upon, and the board member, calculating his exposure, had concluded that his best position was aligned with the company rather than distanced from it. So we're okay? She asked. We're functional. That's different from okay. He paused. Functional is what we have right now. Functional is workable, she said. Yes. A brief silence. How's the painting? She looked back through the lab window at the Hartley piece on its easel under the task lamp. First pass is done, she said. It's going to take a while. But it's salvageable? Yes, she said. It's salvageable. She could hear the quality of his silence on the other end. The particular quality of someone who understood she was answering more than the question she'd been asked. Good, he said. I'll see you tonight. She put the phone back in her pocket and stood in the corridor for another moment. Through the lab window, the painting waited with its damaged upper quarter, the lifted paint catching the edge of the lamplight in a way that made the damage visible at this angle and invisible from another. That was the thing about damage under good light. It showed you exactly where the work needed to happen. She put her gloves back on and went in. The Hartley painting took 11 weeks to stabilize. Naomi had known it would take approximately that long from the first full assessment she'd done in that Monday morning return, when she'd mapped the delamination under raking light and calculated the number of treatment sessions the upper left quarter would require before the paint layer would hold safely on its own. 11 weeks was not a guess. It was a projection based on evidence, the same way most of her projections were based, and it landed almost exactly where she'd put it. She finished the final consolidation pass on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, when the light through the lab's high windows had the particular quality of November, thin and clear and without warmth, the kind of light that was honest about what it illuminated. She worked for 3 hours without stopping, the way she worked when she was close to the end of something, and when she set down her tools and stepped back and looked at what the Hartley had become under her hands over those 11 weeks, she felt the specific quiet satisfaction of work completed. Not pride, exactly, more like the settling of something that had been in motion for a long time. The painting was not perfect. Conservation was never about perfect. The delamination had been arrested and the paint layer was now stable, and the damage, if you looked closely with the right light, was still visible as history, visible as a record of what had happened to the thing, not erased but stabilized, present but no longer progressing. That was the goal. That had always been the goal. She cleaned her tools and wrote up her treatment notes in the specific careful language of someone who understood their records needed to stand alone, independent of her presence. She described what she'd found and what she'd done and what the current condition was. She recommended a monitoring schedule. She signed the report and dated it and filed it. Then she sat on the lab stool for a while and let the quiet of the lab be what it was. The legal proceedings had moved at the pace of legal proceedings. which is to say, slowly, and with the specific grinding quality of a process that is thorough in proportion to how much it does not care about the experience of the people inside it. Gerald Cross had entered a plea agreement in the 7th week. His attorney had negotiated it with the efficiency of someone who understood that the evidence was comprehensive and that the only remaining variable was sentencing, and Gerald's cooperation, which was, in the end, extensive, had shaped the agreement in the ways cooperation shapes such things. He was 68 years old. His attorney had argued the age, the absence of prior record, the cooperation. The prosecutors had argued 11 years, and the specific calculated nature of the scheme. The agreement landed somewhere between those arguments, as agreements do. Naomi had not attended any of the proceedings. She'd been advised she could, had been told her presence was not required, and had decided that watching Gerald Cross negotiate the legal consequences of choices he'd made over 11 years was not something she needed to witness in person to have an opinion about. She'd read the filings when they were available. She'd stayed current through the investigators and through Damien's legal team, who kept them informed at whatever level of detail they wanted. She'd wanted a reasonable level of detail, not every development, but the shape of things. Margaret had not taken a plea. That had not surprised anyone who knew her. Margaret Cross was not a woman who accepted the narrative that someone else constructed for her, and a plea agreement required accepting both the facts as established and the characterization of those facts. And Margaret had spent 63 years being the one who characterized things. Her attorney had filed multiple motions that delayed the proceedings through their normal channels. The procedural machinery of a case involving a defendant with resources, which moved differently than a case involving a defendant without them. The trial date had been set and reset twice. It was now scheduled for the following spring. Damien had followed this closely, and with an equanimity that Naomi understood was not distance from the situation, but rather the result of months of deliberate work on his own relationship to it. He'd started seeing a therapist in the 3rd week after the wedding, not because anyone had told him to, but because he'd recognized with the same matter-of-fact assessment he brought to operational problems, that he had things he needed to process that were not going to process themselves, and that the alternative to deliberate processing was carrying them until they became something else. He told her about the therapy over dinner, plainly, without the slight embarrassment that men sometimes brought to that admission. She'd said, "Good." He'd said, "Yeah." They'd moved on to other things. She'd started seeing someone herself, 2 months in, for the same reasons. Not crisis, not breakdown, just the recognition that the events of the year had generated material that needed space. She'd found a therapist who worked with the particular combination of professional precision and emotional restraint that characterized how Naomi operated. Someone who didn't push for more expressiveness than Naomi naturally had, and who worked within the architecture of how she actually processed things. It helped in the specific ways that such things help, not by removing anything, but by making more room for it. In the 4th month, Damien made a public statement. He'd drafted it himself, with input from Priya and his legal team, and he'd shown it to Naomi before it went out. She'd read it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with her coffee and suggested 3 changes. One word in the 2nd paragraph that was doing too much work and needed to be simpler, a sentence in the middle that was accurate but that read as defensive rather than explanatory, and the ending, which had a note in it that sounded like apology without being one, which was the worst of both options. He'd taken all 3 changes. The statement acknowledged the full scope of what the investigation had uncovered. It described the timeline, the early irregularities, the point at which he'd commissioned the investigation, the decision to allow the wedding to proceed as planned. It said, without embellishment, "I made the decision to act publicly rather than privately because I believed transparency was the only response proportionate to the scale of what had been done, and because the people most affected by these actions deserved to know what they were dealing with." It did not characterize his parents with hostility, and it did not perform forgiveness. It was, Naomi thought, exactly the right kind of honest, the kind that said what it needed to say without using honesty as a performance. The response was, as these things go, substantial. Not all of it favorable. There were commentators who questioned the choice to use a wedding ceremony as the vehicle for a public exposure, who found something distasteful in the staging of it, who felt that regardless of the justification, there was something that didn't sit right about the theatrical quality of the event. Naomi read those pieces and sat with them, because she thought they deserved to be sat with. She didn't fully agree, but she understood the concern, and she thought the discomfort of being questioned was not something she needed to defend herself against. She'd made a choice. The choice had consequences, including this one. She wrote her own statement in the 6th month. It was shorter than Damien's. She wrote it the way she wrote treatment notes, in the first person, in plain language, describing what she had observed and what she had done and why. She did not characterize herself as brave or strategic or any of the other words that had been attached to her in the press coverage. She wrote, "I paid attention to things that didn't add up, and I documented what I found. And when I had enough documentation, I decided to use it. That's what the work required. It was also what I required of myself." She added one thing at the end, which Damien read and said nothing about for a long moment, and then said, "Yes, that." She wrote, "I grew up being told that the best thing you could do with difficult knowledge was manage it quietly. Keep it contained. Don't create disruption. I understood eventually that advice is designed to protect the people who benefit from the quiet. It is not designed to protect you." She sent it, and then she didn't read the responses because she'd said what she had to say, and reading the responses wouldn't change it, and she had the Hartleys' final monitoring report to complete. The estate was formally included in the asset review in the 5th month and sold through a court-managed process in the 8th. Howard, the estate's general manager, had been informed 3 months before the sale and had been given a severance package that Damien had negotiated outside the legal process, directly and personally, which required several conversations with the attorneys about what was possible and some creative structuring. Howard had been, in the end, taken care of. The other long-term staff had been handled similarly, less comprehensively, but handled. Damien had tracked each one. Naomi knew this because she'd seen the list on his desk one evening, handwritten, each name with a note beside it. What had been arranged, what was still pending. It was the kind of list a person made when they needed to know that they'd done what they could. The estate sold to a private buyer who had plans to convert it into a boutique hospitality property. The portraits in the entry hall, including Gerald Cross's father doing his impression of someone confident, went to auction. The furniture and art were itemized and dispersed through the asset process. The garden, which had been maintained to a standard that required 6 staff members and a significant annual budget, would presumably become someone else's responsibility. Damien did not attend the sale. He received a notification from the attorney on the day it closed and responded with 3 words, "Good, thank you." Then he came home and cooked dinner, which he rarely did but did competently when he chose to, and they ate at the kitchen table and Morris occupied his chair, and it was an ordinary evening in the way ordinary evenings had begun to be possible again. "How do you feel about it?" Naomi asked. "Lighter," he said, which I didn't expect to be the word. He considered it. "I thought I'd feel something more complicated." "Maybe complicated already happened," she said. He thought about that. Maybe it did. Caroline Marsh had met with them in the 5th week, in a restaurant near her apartment that she'd chosen, and that was quiet enough for a real conversation. She was, as she'd appeared at the wedding, a woman with the bearing of someone who had spent decades learning to be easy to underestimate. She told them what she knew. She told it plainly, without excessive preamble, in the organized way of someone who had been arranging it in her mind since she'd sent the text. She'd been Margaret's closest friend for 30 years. And in those 30 years, she'd understood things about the way the Cross family operated that she had chosen, repeatedly, not to examine. Not because she was stupid, and not entirely because she was complicit, more because there is a category of comfortable proximity that most people maintain, which is the proximity to people you value that doesn't require you to look at the things about them that would end the value. She'd looked away from things. She'd told herself they were none of her business. "When I saw the screens," she said, "and I heard the recording, I knew her voice in that recording. I've known her voice for 30 years, and I thought, I knew this was possible. I didn't know the specific thing, but I knew this was possible, and I decided not to look at it." She paused. "That's not a crime. It's also not nothing." "What do you want to do with what you know?" Damien asked. She'd looked at him directly. "I'd like to be formally interviewed by your investigators. I'm aware that my information may not be legally significant at this point, but I'd like it to be on record." She paused. "I think being on record is the minimum thing I can do." The meeting had lasted 2 hours. She'd provided the investigators with a formal interview the following week. Whether any of it would affect the legal proceedings was uncertain, and she'd known it was uncertain, and she'd done it anyway. On their way out of the restaurant, Naomi had stopped and said, "Can I ask you something?" Caroline had said, "Yes." Why did you reach out? You could have. The practical thing, the safe thing, was to stay out of it. Caroline had looked at her with an expression that had several things in it. I'm 70 years old, she said. I've done the practical thing enough times that I know what it costs. She paused. It costs more than it saves. You just pay on a longer schedule. Naomi had thought about that statement many times since. She thought about it on the Thursday afternoon in November when she finished the Hartley treatment, sitting on the lab stool in the thin, clear November light. The practical thing, the safe thing, had been available to her too. 3 weeks before the wedding, standing in a parking structure in her car after leaving the estate, she had known what she'd overheard, and she could have done any number of things with it that were smaller than what she'd done. She could have confronted Margaret privately, she could have told Damien and let him handle it. She could have canceled the wedding and walked away and built a version of her life that avoided the entire structure of the Cross family and everything tangled in it. She'd chosen the harder version. Not because she was fearless. She'd been afraid, in the specific cold way of someone who has identified a real threat and is planning to move toward it anyway, but because the smaller options all shared a feature she couldn't accept. They all required a form of quiet. They all required that the thing continue to exist in shadow, acknowledged by the people in the room, but not visible to the people outside it. She had spent 11 years working with things that hid their damage. She understood the value of making damage visible. You couldn't treat what you couldn't see. She had also spent 11 years understanding that making damage visible was not the same as destroying the thing. The Hartley was proof of that, sitting stable and honest on its easel, its history visible in the right light, no longer progressing toward the failure that had been quietly building when she first laid hands on it. The question was never whether to expose the damage. The question was always what you did with it after. In the 9th month, she and Damien bought an apartment. Not his apartment, a different one, in a building neither of them had lived in before, in a neighborhood they'd walked through together once on a Sunday afternoon that they both liked for reasons they hadn't examined closely, but that had something to do with the scale of it, the particular mix of old and working and not yet arrived, that made it feel like a place where actual life happened, rather than a place constructed for people to perform living in. The process of finding it had been, like most processes of finding homes, longer and more complicated than it should have been. They'd looked at 14 apartments over 2 months. They disagreed about 3 of them. Not fought, disagreed, which was a distinction they'd gotten better at maintaining, and agreed easily about the rest. The one they chose was not perfect. The second bedroom had a window that looked at a wall rather than anything. The kitchen was smaller than Damien wanted, and the building's elevator was old enough that it required a specific technique to get the door to close on the first try. But it had good light in the main room, and the layout felt like something they could move around in without managing each other. And the neighborhood, when they stood on the street outside after the final walkthrough, felt like a place they could actually live. They signed the papers on a Wednesday afternoon. On the drive back, Damien said, "I keep waiting to feel like we're making a mistake." About the apartment. About any of it. The apartment, the company, He gestured at the general situation of the year. "I keep waiting for the thing I didn't see." "You might have missed something," she said. He looked at her. "That's not reassuring," he said. "It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be accurate." She looked out the window. "Missing things is possible. It's always been possible. It was possible before the wedding, and it's possible now. The question is whether you've done the reasonable work to minimize it." She paused. "You have. We have. Whatever is left in the category of what we don't know, we'll deal with it when we know it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're very pragmatic about uncertainty," he said. "It's the job," she said. "You work with damaged things long enough, you stop expecting certainty. You start working with condition assessments and probabilities." He looked at her. "Do you ever just want certainty?" "Constantly," she said. "Wanting it and being able to have it are different problems." They moved in 6 weeks later. The move was imperfect, in the specific ways that moves are imperfect. Things that should have fit didn't. Things they'd thought they needed turned out to be irrelevant in the new context. The first night was spent surrounded by boxes and a configuration that made the apartment feel nothing like it would eventually feel. Morris investigated every room with judicial thoroughness and finally selected a windowsill in the main room as his primary position, which was, as far as anyone could tell, his official endorsement of the choice. Naomi unpacked the things she'd brought from her old apartment, the accumulated objects of 11 years of a particular life. Books, mostly. Some equipment. The small portable magnification tools she kept at home for the occasional work she did outside the lab. A framed print of a Sargent watercolor that had hung above her desk since graduate school. The photograph of her mother, which was one of 2 photographs she had of her. Her mother was not a woman who had photographed easily, had always slightly turned away from the camera with the expression of someone who felt that being photographed required an explanation she hadn't yet provided. In this photograph, she was looking at something out of frame, not aware of being captured, and her expression was the particular alert softness of someone who has seen something that interests them. Naomi had always thought that expression told you more about her mother than any posed photograph would have. She set it on the bookshelf. Damien came in from the other room and looked at it. "Your mom," he said. "Yes." He looked at the photograph for a moment. "What was she like?" Nobody asked that, usually. They asked what had happened, or they expressed sympathies, or they moved on from the mention of her quickly in the way people moved on from mentions of dead parents. He just asked what she was like. "Practical," Naomi said. More practical than warm, though she was both. She had very little patience for things that were supposed to be important but weren't actually important. She paused. She would have had extremely specific opinions about this year. Good opinions or bad? Complicated ones, accurate ones. She looked at the photograph. She would have approved of the documentation strategy. She would have found the whole wedding as venue thing questionable and then come around on it. She paused. She would have liked you. Not immediately. She didn't do anything immediately. But eventually. He was quiet for a moment. "I would have liked to know her," he said. Not performing sentiment, just saying the thing that was true. "I know," she said. The trial began in March. Margaret Cross entered the courtroom on the first day with the bearing she had always carried, straight-spined, controlled, the posture maintained as if it were structural rather than chosen. She was wearing a suit that communicated nothing ostentatious and everything deliberate. Her attorney was excellent. Naomi had read enough about him to know that, and the early days of the proceedings confirmed it. He was doing what excellent attorneys did, shaping the context, challenging the framing, moving methodically through the procedural landscape, with the patience of someone who understood that the outcome of trials was influenced not just by evidence but by the accumulated effect of how the evidence was presented over time. The prosecution's case was built on 8 months of documentation, 300 pages of financial records, testimony from 7 financial professionals, and the recordings and communications that had formed the original foundation of what Naomi had taken to the microphone 11 months earlier. It was thorough in the way that Meridian Group's work had always been thorough. It was the full record, finally in its proper context. Naomi testified in the 3rd week. She had prepared with the legal team extensively, had gone through the questions and the likely cross-examination lines with the prosecutors, had sat in mock sessions that were uncomfortable in the way mock sessions were designed to be uncomfortable. On the actual day, she wore the same things she wore to work. Nothing that communicated formality beyond what the occasion required. Nothing that performed anything. She sat in the witness box and answered the questions she was asked in the plain declarative language of someone describing what they had observed and what they had done. The cross-examination was pointed. Margaret's attorney was good at his job, and he worked the edges of her testimony with the precision of someone who understood that direct contradiction was less useful than incremental destabilization. He asked about her methods of obtaining the evidence. He asked about the decision to proceed with the wedding rather than going to authorities immediately. He asked, carefully and in a way that required careful answers, about the choice to use a public event as the vehicle for disclosure. She answered all of it. "Isn't it true," he said at one point, "that the decision to present this information at a wedding in front of 300 guests rather than through standard legal channels was a strategic choice intended to maximize reputational damage to my clients?" She looked at him. "It was a strategic choice," she said. "The strategy was transparency, not damage. The reputational consequences were the result of what my clients-in-law had done, not of the decision to make it visible. Visibility doesn't create damage. It reveals it." The attorney moved on. Damien was in the courtroom that day, in the gallery, seated with the kind of stillness that meant he was managing what he was feeling by focusing everything into posture. She could see him in her peripheral vision when she was in the witness box, and she didn't look at him directly because looking at him directly would have changed something in her face that she needed to keep unchanged, and she thought, later. They would have later. She stepped down from the box after 2 hours and walked through the gallery, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked out into the March afternoon without speaking. And when they got to the bottom of the courthouse steps, she stopped and let herself exhale fully for the first time in what felt like several hours. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Give me a minute." He gave her the minute. He stood beside her on the courthouse steps in the March air, which was cold and real and not the climate-controlled air of the courtroom, and waited. "He's good," she said. "Fielding?" "Yes, he's very good." "It didn't help," she said. "No," Damien agreed. It didn't. The verdict came in the 7th week of trial. Margaret Cross was found guilty on 11 of 14 counts. The 3 counts the jury did not convict on were the most complex of the financial charges. The ones where the evidence, while substantial, required a level of forensic financial reasoning that the prosecution had not sufficiently condensed for a lay jury, which was a limitation of translation, not of fact. The 11 counts they did convict on were the core of it: the fraud, the conspiracy, the documented manipulation of corporate structures over a decade. Naomi was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was in the lab, midway through a treatment session on a different piece, and Damien texted her the single word, guilty. She read it, sat with it for 30 seconds, and then resumed the treatment session because the pigment she was working with had a short window and couldn't be left. She finished the session and cleaned her tools and walked out of the lab into the corridor and stood there. And what she felt was not triumph. She had known it wouldn't be triumph. Triumph would have required the situation to feel like a win, and it didn't feel like a win. It felt like the end of a particular long process, the closing of an accounting, the formal settling of something that had needed settling. A relief, maybe. The specific relief of the end of sustained effort. She called Damien. "Where are you?" she said. "Outside the courthouse. Priya's here. There are cameras. How are you?" A pause. "Processing," he said. "You?" "Processing," she said. They stayed on the phone without saying anything for a moment, which was its own communication. "Come home when you can," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I will." But sentencing was 6 weeks later. Margaret received a sentence that the attorneys had been projecting within a range for months, and the sentence landed in the middle of the range, as sentences often do. Gerald's cooperation agreement had already been formalized. His sentence had been delivered 2 months earlier and had reflected both the cooperation and the assessment of his role, present, enabling, not the architect. Sienna had cooperated fully over the 11 months of proceedings. Her own legal resolution came down in the same week as Margaret's sentencing. A plea agreement, a suspended sentence with conditions, several years of financial restrictions, and reporting requirements. She would not go to prison. She would spend the next several years under legal supervision, which was not comfortable and which she had chosen cooperation specifically to arrive at rather than the alternative. She wrote Naomi a letter, an actual letter on paper, which arrived in an envelope that Naomi recognized from the return address as being sent from an address she didn't know in a city 2 states away. The letter was not long. It didn't attempt to reconstruct or explain. Sienna had clearly understood that explanation wasn't what the letter was for. It said, "I know sorry doesn't fix it. I'm saying it anyway for me because I need to have said it plainly at least once. I hope you build something good. I think you will." Naomi read it twice. Then she put it in the drawer where she kept the things she wasn't ready to discard, but wasn't ready to file as resolved. She'd get back to it eventually. That was the drawer's function. On a Saturday morning in May, nearly 14 months after the wedding, Naomi and Damien drove 3 hours to a nature preserve in the eastern part of the state that neither of them had been to and that had come up in a conversation they'd had months earlier about places they'd been meaning to go and hadn't gotten to. The drive was the kind of drive that worked because neither of them needed to fill silence. They talked when something was worth saying and didn't when it wasn't, and the radio played whatever it played, and the landscape moved past in the particular way of landscape in May. The green of things that had come back without anyone organizing them. The untidy abundance of a season that didn't know or care what the previous year had looked like. The preserve was not crowded on a Saturday morning in May. They walked for 3 hours on trails that were marked but not maintained to the standard of trails that expected heavy use, occasionally overgrown, occasionally requiring a choice between two paths with equal claim to being the right one. They got mildly lost once, in the way that mildly lost actually meant 15 minutes of consulting the paper map they'd picked up at the entrance and recalibrating. At some point, sitting on a rock formation above a ravine with no particular view except trees and the particular light of May coming through them, Damien said, "Can I tell you something I've been thinking about?" "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking about what my parents built," he said. "The company, the estate, the thing they spent 40 years constructing. And I keep coming back to the fact that they built it on what they thought was an understanding of how the world worked." He paused. "They thought the world rewarded the people who controlled the narrative, who got to the resources first and held them, and made sure the story about those resources was the story they'd written." He looked at the trees. "And they weren't entirely wrong. That does work. It works for a long time." "Until it doesn't," she said. "Until the person you decided to use as a scapegoat turns out to be a conservator who documents everything," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it, the wry acknowledgement of a thing that was terrible, and also from a certain distance had a quality. She half smiled. "Occupational hazard. The thing I keep thinking is," he continued, "they lost everything trying to hold on to everything. And the holding on was the problem. The holding on was what required the fraud and the cover-up and the elaborate scheme. If they'd just—" He stopped. "I don't know. Let things be what they were. Let me build what I was building. Let you be who you were. If they'd just stopped trying to control the outcome, there wouldn't have been an outcome to lose." She thought about that. "Some people can't do that," she said. "Not as a character flaw, exactly. More as a structural limitation. They can't see a variable without wanting to fix it. They can't be in a situation without managing it." She turned a small rock over in her hand. "Your mother has spent her whole life in a defensive posture. The problem is, if you're always defending, you can't tell the difference between a threat and just a thing that exists." He was quiet. "I do some of that," he said. "Yes," she said. "Not to that degree." "No, but the impulse is related." She looked at him. "That's why the therapy is useful. Not because you're your mother, because you grew up in a system that taught you that control was safety, and unlearning that takes active work." He sat with that for a moment. "You're not gentle about this," he said. "Did you want gentle?" "No," he said. "No, I wanted accurate." He looked at the trees again. "That's what I've always wanted from you. That's actually what got me, at the beginning, the accuracy." She thought about that first meeting, the acquisitions review, the man who'd actually read the catalog, the paying attention. She'd thought, this one pays attention. She hadn't known then that the thing she was responding to was recognition, a person like her own kind, operating differently but from the same underlying orientation, toward the real thing, whatever it cost. "We're going to be okay," she said. Not a performance, not a reassurance offered to manage his anxiety, just the assessment of someone who had examined the question from multiple angles over a long period of time and had arrived at a conclusion. He looked at her. "You sound certain," he said. "I sound like someone who has done the reasonable work to minimize uncertainty," she said, "which is the closest I get to certain." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll take it." They had the first dance 6 weeks later. It was not planned. That was the thing about it. There was no occasion, no event, no reason for it, except that they were in the apartment on a Friday evening with dinner finished and the dishes not yet done, and Morris installed in his windowsill position regarding them without opinion, and Damien had put something on the speakers, something quiet and instrumental, and then he'd looked at her and said, "We never actually did this." She'd looked at him. "No," she said, "we didn't." He offered his hand the way people offer their hand when they're slightly self-conscious about the gesture, but making it anyway, and she took it. And they moved around the small cleared space between the coffee table and the bookshelf in the way of two people who were not particularly gifted dancers and knew it. in the imperfect and actual way of a thing that was finally happening because the time for it had arrived rather than because it had been planned. It lasted approximately one song. Morris watched them from the windowsill with the expression of a being who had seen stranger things and had no particular comment. It was not the first dance they had planned. It was not on a polished ballroom floor with 300 guests and a string quartet. It was in their apartment, with the dishes still on the table and the imperfect second bedroom window looking at a wall and the elevator in the lobby that required a specific technique to close. It was them, and the song, and the small cleared space, and the Friday evening. It was, Naomi thought, the right version. Not because it was better than what they'd planned, because it was real in the way that plans are not real, in the way that only the thing that actually happens is real, with all its ordinary imperfections, its lack of audience, its failure to be more than it was, which was two people who had come through a year that had tried to break them and had found themselves on the other side of it, still standing, still choosing each other, dancing badly in their own living room on a Friday night. That was the thing about damage, she had learned. Not just in paintings, in everything. It didn't have to be catastrophic. If you caught it early enough, if you were paying attention, if you did the work rather than looking away. Damage was not the end of the thing. It was information. It told you what needed tending. It told you where the care had to go. The rest was the work. Patient, quiet, unglamorous, necessary. Not the work of perfection. The work of keeping something real from progressing toward failure. She knew how to do that work. She'd been doing it her whole life. She put her head against Damien's shoulder in the apartment they'd chosen, on the Friday evening that was theirs, and the song played, and the city outside did what cities did. And Morris watched from the windowsill without judgment, and it was enough. It was, in the specific and uncomplicated way of things that are true, more than enough.